Hi guys, welcome back to another exciting video, so sit back, relax, and let's get started. Also, here's the full summary since it wouldn't fit in the summary box. Verity Ashford was a quirkless teen. She never desired to be a hero, but she wished she had some kind of power. Heroes had failed her family, but she had too. If she had been born with any quirk, even if it was a weak one, then maybe things would be different. At least she would be back in Texas, where life was normal and somewhat peaceful. Now she's stuck with her Mimi in the backwoods of Louisiana, and she's never felt more miserable. Almost a year after the incident that claimed the lives of her parents and siblings, Verity is confronted by pro-hero Saul, the sidekick of the famous pro-hero Selector. Saul then reveals a devastating and great truth to Verity. Selector is dead, and his quirk has been passed on to Verity. A few signed documents and a trying summer of training later, Verity finds herself at the entrance of UA, a world-renowned hero academy in Japan. There, she meets and makes friends with her peers in Class 1. While she struggles to control her new quirk, she finds solace in the support of her newfound friends. At the same time, she becomes slightly disturbed by how much her life parallels that of her friend Izuku Midoriya. Not long after becoming friends, the two find out that they have much more in common than their unhealthy obsession with quirk analysis. That's when Izuku and All Might share the truth about One for All before asking her to join them in the fight against All for One. Verity quickly agrees to help them put the villain out of commission. Surely, it's a task that she and Izuku can accomplish together easily, right? Meanwhile, All for One watches Verity from a distance. For whatever reason, Verity's quirk is awfully similar to One for All, but he quickly realizes that it's too similar when he's unable to take it from her. Luckily for him, there's a darkness in Verity's heart that she just can't shake away. So, if he can't take her quirk, then he must find a way to control it. Will Verity be able to help Izuku stop AFO? Or will she allow her past to push her into darkness? See the end of the work for more notes. Chapter 1. Chapter text. For 1 second, everything in Saul's vision stilled. Rubble stopped midair, rescued citizens were frozen in furor, and the villain, Negligence, had paused mid-fall after a small iron beam had been lodged in his chest. However, the most notable difference was the loss of sound. There wasn't even a ringing sound hitting her ears. If she didn't know any better, she would have thought someone was using their quirk to stop time. If only that were the truth. In reality, Saul had just witnessed a spray of bullets hit her mentor while his quirk was being suppressed by a nearby villain. Subdue. While it couldn't stop Selector's powers entirely, it had made him vulnerable. Subdue, who could only use his quirk on one person at a time, had been aiming for her. Unfortunately, Selector had chosen to take the hit, which had crippled him during his most important fight. A fight that she later realized would be her mentor's last. Even still, he had just enough strength to throw the beam at Negligence, while Saul used her quirk to blind Subdue. Unlike Negligence, Subdue would live, but his quirk will be more difficult to use since he's blind. Serves him right for his help in the slaughter of hundreds of innocent civilians. The two terrors had been the leaders of Free Felons, a group of villains who were aiming to take over the eastern coast of the United States. If Selector hadn't been able to stop them, then they might have succeeded. Both villains had incredible quirks. While Subdue could suppress quirks, Negligence could find the faults in people's quirks and use those faults against them. Once he found a fault, he would make the quirk fail or fight against its host. For instance, the quirk of newscaster Bob Walsford allows him to connect to any camera within a 10-mile radius and show the picture on any newscast. Of course, Bob was associated with the Hero Broadcasting Channel, or HBC, so they often received the footage first. From what Saul understands, it has some kind of cord for an earlobe to air it so quickly. Anyway, Negligence was able to find a fault in Bob's quirk and short-circuited all of the cameras. If he wasn't a villain, Saul would have thought Negligence's quirk was pretty cool. However, she certainly wasn't thinking that now. As she stared down at her fallen mentor, bright red BLD trickled down the side of the man's mouth, matching his multiple bullet wounds. How he was still conscious. She wasn't sure. Maybe it was a part of his quirk that allowed him a few extra moments despite the wounds that should have stopped his heart seconds ago. Of course, it was just like Greg to beat impossible odds. So, surely he would overcome this, right? Her legs began to shake as she made her way to him. During her years as a sidekick, Saul had witnessed many gruesome and gory sights. Once, she saw a villain named Flex lose his footing on a skyscraper before he fell to the ground with a splat. Brain matter had stained the Chicago sidewalk in such a way that the city was forced to repave it. Another time, she vomited at the sight of a civilian who had been burnt to a crisp by someone with a fire quirk. Saul would never forget the smell of burned flesh. It had been revolting. Yet somehow, the sight of her mentor dying before her was much, much worse. How did it come to this? Negligence had been the toughest villain Selector had ever faced, but the hero should have won without a problem. Just how was Negligence able to defeat someone with such a powerful quirk? Sure, Saul had seen it, but she still couldn't believe it. Greg, being so strong, should have won this fight easily. The hero continued to spiral as she processed the scene before her. This is Greg. Who is the hero? Selector, the person who had inspired her most, the one who had taught her how to properly interrogate a villain, and that horseradish isn't a bad condiment. He's the guy who would force her to watch old hero documentaries and go on boring patrols that ended with ice cream at Betty's corner store. Selector was the hero who had accepted her despite her weaknesses. He had trained and molded her into a successful hero. If it weren't for him, Saul would have been stuck in politics forever, and that would have sucked. He can't die. Greg can't die. The rubble slowly began falling to the ground again. He just can't. Sure, he's an older hero, but Selector is too strong to die like this. Negligence landed on the ground. She heard the thud sound his body made as it hit the pavement. He can't die here. However, Saul couldn't ignore the BLD that seemed to be everywhere. It coated Greg's long, dark braids and seeped into his bright, yellow suit. Red dripped along the broken concrete that surrounded his large body, and Saul crumpled to the ground as the world regained motion and sound. No, 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 she screamed, moving her hands towards the wound on his heart. Any attempts to staunch it would be futile, but she couldn't help herself. What do I do? Saul breathed out. What do I? A hand weakly rested on top of hers. Through the blur of tears, she realized that it belonged to Selector, and somehow, he was smiling at her. It's okay, Saul, he said through a coughing fit. The quirk has left me. It's being carried to her now. What? She asked through bated breath. I already told you that quick search found her for me, he said calmly. Rubbing his thumb over the back of her hand, the BLD swirled like bright red paint. My successor notebook has all of the— he paused to cough. It has all of the information you need about her if you hurry. You will make it just as it reaches her. Just like Second Sight said it would share my notes with her. It will make things easier for the both of you. No, she yelled at him. No. Streams of tears traveled along her cheeks. You can't leave me yet. I'm sorry, Selector said gently, but it's time. He gave her hand a small squeeze. The two of you have a long journey ahead of you. But Saul, he said, wheezing, you're ready for this? I made sure that you would be. I'm sorry that I'm leaving you with a responsibility that should be mine. But Second promised you would both be fine without me. No, I need you, she swallowed, trying to grasp the reality that had befallen her. How? I mean, what should I do? His grin grew wider. What you do best, he laughed, but winced from the pain light up her path. Even with death looming around the corner, his warm brown eyes were as lively as ever. She let out a half-hearted chuckle through the sobs. Of course, you would joke at a time like this. His smile softened as his hand trembled to reach her cheek. Selector brushed her tears away and said, but it's the truth. As his hand began to shake more, Saul grabbed onto it. After all, little lamp, you illuminated mine, he wheezed out. And here I thought my quirk could only blind you. She attempted to joke back. If it had fallen flat, her mentor didn't notice. He got out. It did sometimes. But I mean what I said. You helped me out of a dark place, and I'll never forget that. Never. And I won't forget what you taught me, Saul attested, squeezing his hand in return. So, he barely whispered, this is where your new adventure begins. I leave it to you two now. He trailed off, and as his hand went limp in hers, Saul knew he was gone. Verity Ashford has always been amazing, quirkless. Meanwhile, the rest of her family had incredible quirks, and her friends had constantly reminded her of it. Her mother had a powerful nature quirk, which allowed her to talk to animals and grow plants with ease. It was because of her quirk that she ran a successful flower cutting business during the summer. Verity had loved helping her mom cut flowers to fill the cooler in the shop. Her father had some kind of technology quirk, which made him a manager in his job at the defense plant when she was a kid. He would often produce small sparks of electricity in his hands and chase Verity and her siblings around the house. Her mom often yelled at him for it, but would also scream and laugh when he started chasing her too. Alton, her younger brother, had a quirk that allowed his art to come to life. Too many times had his digital art pranked her by scaring her in the middle of the night at one point. Her mother had even grounded him for it. Alton stopped tormenting her so much after that. Lastly, there was her lovely sister, Ellie, who had a baking quirk, which was the same quirk their late great-grandmother had possessed too. The girl could bake anything she dreamed of, which was great until she had a streak of only baking sweets, so their parents had to limit Ellie's baking times to keep a healthy household, which wasn't easy since her desserts were the best. Yet Verity, the eldest Ashford child, had been born talented, quirkless, so she spent most of her life trying to make up for that shortcoming by becoming a responsible, studious daughter. If she was asked to watch her sibling, she did it without complaint. If her mom couldn't cook dinner, Verity would do it. Whenever her parents asked her to help around the house or run an errand, she didn't question it. Additionally, her family valued education. Both of her parents had graduated from college, which is why Verity had immersed herself in her studies at school. Her teachers praised her intelligence, and she often helped them with after-school chores. Sometimes, she would often get pulled out of study hall to tutor some of their struggling students. It took away some of her free time, but she liked to be needed. Truthfully, if they didn't know any better, her friends might have said that people-pleasing was Verity's quirk. Despite lacking a unique power, her parents loved her all the same. If anything, they doted on her more than her younger siblings. However, it only made her feel worse since it reminded her of what she didn't have. Plus, Verity didn't want her siblings to grow jealous or hateful towards her. She knew that they needed attention too, but if they ever felt that way, her siblings never showed it. But the girl wished she had a quirk. Even if it sucked, a weak quirk was better than no quirk at all, and it's not like she wanted to be a hero or anything. Verity preferred to keep a low profile. And while she could be fiery, determined, and goal-oriented, she wasn't much of a fighter. Plus, there were plenty of other ways to help people other than by fighting villains. Speaking of heroes, it surprised Verity that there weren't any heroes in her family now. There were a few in her extended family, but aside from that, no one had even mentioned a desire to become a hero, although she had always thought her brother's quirk would be extremely useful in battle. Heck, he could make an army of soldiers with a single pencil and sheet of paper. But Alton preferred entering the entertainment industry over the heroism industry, which had a mountain of problems anyway. It had all started a few years after the hero All Might defeated some villain in Japan. Peace settled over the globe, which caused people in America to relax more. That's when the Fall of Heroes event began in her country. About 2 years ago, the United States began having a steady decline in heroes, which prompted the hero branch of the military, called the Quirkment, to begin a nationwide campaign to find them. They called this campaign Heroes Arise. To combat the fall of heroes, new hero schools and universities began popping up all over the country. Verity guessed that their efforts worked since a few of her friends had transferred to the brand new Dallas Hero Conservatory, DHA for short. Once opened last school year, she remembers her sister rambling on about it because the DHA was offering a culinary program for those with food-related quirks. Verity's heart sank in her chest. It was devastating that her sister never had the chance to apply for it. Taking a bite of a sugar cookie, she thought about her sister. While Betty's Bakes could make some decent sugar cookies, they paled in comparison to the ones that Ellie used to make. Her frosting was much more flavorful than this bland paste. "Mimi," Verity called out as she stood up from the kitchen table. "I'm going out on the trail. I'll be back in a little while." Mimi was Verity's grandmother on her father's side. The old lady had taken her in after the incident that left her an orphan, which happened about a year ago. In that time, she had grown a lot closer to Mimi, to Verity's chagrin. She had even picked up some of her grandmother's speech habits, which caused the kids at school to make fun of her. Granted, she didn't care what they thought. To hell with those demons. "Okay, sweetheart, just be back before it gets dark," Mimi called back from the living room. Verity threw on her tennis shoes and rushed out the door. It was almost summer in Louisiana, but today had been cooler due to the storms that had rolled in over the week. Sure, it was humid, but at least it wasn't completely miserable out. At least it was good enough weather for her to walk along her late grandfather's trails. She hadn't walked in the woods behind the house for a few weeks since it had been too hot even now. With the cooler weather, her blue t-shirt was becoming damp with sweat. If she had any complaint at all, then it would be about her hair. Her curly brown locks hated humid Louisiana, making her miss the dire Texas heat, which was slightly more preferable. As she made her way around the abandoned garden, she tucked a curl behind her ear. Long before she was born, Verity's grandparents had built their house in the countryside on a huge plot of land. Her late grandfather, Papa John, worked hard to create a huge garden and built a shop to park his tractor in. However, the old man didn't stop there. He built other, smaller shops that were scattered around the property, and he created trails in the woods behind the house. Verity had explored those trails with her siblings over the years. Throughout her childhood, they would all climb up in one of the old deer stands that stood along the trails and pretend to be heroes saving citizens from burning buildings. None of them wanted to become real heroes, but, like all children, they had fun while pretending to act like them. Plus, each of them had a favorite hero. They would act like her brother would often choose All Might, while her sister liked to be Star and Stripe. And Verity, she would pretend to be Saul, the only sidekick of Selector. Why be a sidekick? Well, Verity always thought Saul was the prettiest hero she had ever seen. Plus, her light quirk was pretty cool. Saul could absorb and manipulate light from any source, which allowed her to shoot lasers from her body. As she looked up at the deer stand in front of her, which was now covered in cobwebs, she sighed. If only she had known how precious those memories would become to her, then she might have savored them a bit more. Now, as her feet shuffled the dirt underneath them, she felt pangs of regret. Maybe if it hadn't been pretend, then maybe, just maybe, if she had a quirk like Saul's, then she could have saved them, lived peacefully. Clenching her fists in frustration, she kicked the ladder that led up to the inside of the deer stand, and that was a mistake. Verity realized the wood was much more solid than she thought as it hit her toes. Quickly lifting her throbbing foot to her hand, she cursed quietly as the ladder landed on the ground with a loud thud. The noise sent a few birds flying away, and she heard a small rustling in the bushes that was probably caused by a spooked rabbit. As she slowly stopped hopping on one foot, Verity stared at the wooden ladder for a moment before sighing again, taking her frustration out on something her grandfather had made wasn't doing her any favors. Heck, Mimi would scold her for it if she had seen it taking a rubber band out of her pocket. Verity threw her brunette hair in a bun before picking up the ladder and putting it back into place once it was where it belonged. Verity peered up at the deer stand's entrance. I wonder if it's still the same. She thought to herself it had been a few years since she had played hero up there, why not take a quick look? Verity gripped both sides of the ladder and put a foot down on the first step after putting some pressure on it. She decided it was sturdy enough to hold her before beginning the climb up. She had almost reached the top of the ladder when it hit her like a softball. Yeah, that was the best way she could describe it. The weight of, well, something similar to that hit her in the chest so hard that her feet slipped, which sent her tumbling several feet down to the ground. Thankfully, Verity landed on her butt, which saved her head. None of her bones seemed to be broken either, and she considered herself lucky that neither of her feet had gotten caught on the wood. However, the wind had been knocked out of her, causing her scream to sound more like a strangled cat. What the hell was that? She seethed while trying to catch her breath. Had it been an animal? Verity didn't see a bird or anything fly into her, and how would it? The thing had hit her in the chest, and the deer stand was right in front of her, so nothing could have physically hit her. The feeling of it wasn't just a weight or an object, it was. Well, she didn't know how to describe the emotions that had suddenly swelled in her heart. As she went to stand up, she suddenly felt a zap tickle her arms. Looking down, some form of blue electricity circled them before fizzling out. The sparks had felt warm against her skin, but they didn't hurt. No, they felt powerful. Powerful. The word began to dance in her head. That was what she was feeling since that thing hit her. Powerful. This isn't real, she gasped as she flipped her arms face up. It can't be, but so, what is this? A long whistle sounded behind the teen, snapping her out of her thoughts. Verity whipped her towards it, and her jaw dropped with shock. No way, she said in awe. Are you? You're. Of course, Verity was having a hard time processing the situation because the woman standing before her was the last person she ever expected to see. Golden blonde hair that was a mix of braids and loose curls drifted past the hero's shoulders. She wore a blue, skin-tight suit that matched the color of her eyes. Her skin was sunkissed, and a few freckles were scattered under her eyes, and along her nose shiny silver daggers sat in the gold sheaths of her belt. The woman's action figure had one just like, although, while Verity's hero figurine was lifeless and collecting dust in Mimi's attic, the woman, no, the hero before her was very real. And true to her figurine, Saul wasn't smiling at Verity. Thanks, Greg, she grumbled. Looks like I've got my work cut out for me because of you. Why, US Saul? The teen squeaked out. While her countenance seemed cold, the hero's blue eyes twinkled with amusement, remembering her first meeting with Selector. She was trying to act a little tough. The kid needed to know her place as the mentee if Saul was going to take the teen in and train her. Then Verity would need to recognize her authority. Sure, Saul could knock sense into her now, but there would be plenty of time for that later. So, she asked coolly, studying her freshly polished nails, guess you aren't a reincarnation of him after all. Saul knew that the passing of Selector's quirk wasn't the same as reincarnation, but she wished it was. It had only been a day since the man passed away, and she could already feel the gaping hole he had left in the hero world. The gap was too big, and she wasn't sure that his successor would be strong enough to fill it. Besides that, Saul wasn't confident that she could create a hero like that out of this kid. Huh? Verity asked as she rubbed her eyes. You are Saul, right? Isn't that your? Yeah, the woman clipped. It's my hero name. Saul. The Saul is standing in the woods with her Saul. One of Chicago's heroes is here at Mimi's house. Saul, the woman she had an action figure of, is talking to her. Oh, she breathed with a smile. I see what's going on. Staring at the hero in awe, she noticed how the sunlight glowed in Saul's hair. She was practically ethereal. The woman paused before taking a step toward the teen. You do. Maybe the girl is a reincarnation after all, Saul thought. Of course, Verity said as she threw up her hands. This is one of those lucid dreams I've read about. Saul paused, blinking for a moment before she began cackling. She should have known the girl would have a hard time understanding this. The hero wanted to call her, but there wasn't enough time. Verity raised a brow. Were all lucid dreams like this? Do your heroes randomly show up to laugh in your face? As she was thinking, she felt a hand ruffle. Relax, kid, the woman said. This isn't a dream, she said as her face fell, but I kind of wish it was. She held her hand out to Verity, who took it, pulling the teen off the ground. Verity dusted off her jeans before staring at the woman in awe. So, this wasn't a dream. What were the odds of this happening? 0, -10. She wasn't sure because this could not be real. Anyway, my name's Saul, she said, pointing at herself. And you? She pointed at the teen. You're Verity Alice Ashford, right? Verity nodded and swallowed. Why, you know my end name. Yep, Selector made sure that I had all of the information I needed to meet you on time, Saul said, looking at the watch on her wrist. If the second plane hadn't been delayed by a storm, then she would have made it sooner. On top of that, an old man in a truck had driven a solid 25 miles per hour during the last 10 minutes of the drive. Otherwise, They would be talking in the air-conditioned house. I was hoping to get here before it happened, but I had to wrap up a few things. Sorry, you fell. Whoa, Verity said with her hands up. What's going on? I don't understand. Saul grimaced. Let's find a place to sit down and talk. There are a lot of details and things we need to work out. Is your Mimi home? You know Mimi? She asked, running a hand through her curls. I know of your Mimi. Saul corrected her. Since she's your legal guardian, I need her present for the conversation we're about to have. Verity looked down at her tennis shoes, which were now covered in dirt. Her gaze moved back up to Saul's. Whatever is going on, it must be important. Why else would a famous hero be here of all places? Honestly, none of it made sense to her. Saul should be with Selector to fight the free felons, who were working to take over the eastern part of the country. Thinking about the group made Verity want to roll her eyes. The group had only become a threat because of their leaders, with one dead and the other in prison. There wasn't much they could do now without those morons. The group didn't have any motivation to keep going. Most likely, they would disband and join another cause that aligned with their belief system. Of course, Selector was probably left to tie up any loose ends the villainous group left behind. Otherwise, he would be here with Saul, right? Also, Verity was useless, quirkless. What reason would Saul have to travel here? Did she think Verity was connected to the villains? Maybe Saul mistook her to be some kind of hacker. Whatever the issue, Verity was growing anxious. So, let's head back, Saul said as she tilted her head towards the direction of the house. The hero didn't like to sweat if she didn't have to. However, she felt someone grab her arm, causing her to stop. Wait, Verity said calmly, can you at least give me a little info on what's happening right now? Moving to face the young girl, Saul hesitated before saying, it's a long story. That's why I want to share it with you while you're sitting down. In the air-conditioned house, Saul thought. Then give me the quick version, the teen said quickly. Verity was buzzing with excitement and nerves. This was about something big, and Verity was being let in on whatever it was. It's a lot to process, Saul drawled, studying the girl's face. The shadows of the trees couldn't hide the anxiety and deep-rooted issues that hid in that face. Saul had read Verity's file about 10 times over the past few hours. The hero hadn't been lying when she said that she had her work cut out for her. Teaching Verity how to trust others was going to be the biggest hurdle of her training. But Saul hated sweating. Her quirk didn't make things much better for her either. Might as well talk about it in a place with air conditioning. Saul tried saying one last time, but she could see in the girl's stormy eyes Verity wasn't going to let this go easily. Just tell me already, Verity quipped back, or at least a snippet of it. PSHH, Saul said, moving her hand to her mouth. A snippet. What are you, 50? Verity crossed her arms before giving a stiff shrug. Mimi uses the word a lot? Okay. A hint of pink spread across the young girl's face. She couldn't remember the last time she had been so embarrassed. Of course, Verity would find herself being made fun of by someone she's idolized since she was 7. Well, never meet your heroes, kids. So, can you tell me something? Anything? Verity asked as she rolled her eyes. I'm not sure what you want from me. I haven't done anything wrong, neither has my family. Even though most of them are dead, I don't have a quirk, so I'm not some hero or villain or vigilante that you would be after. But you do have a quirk, Saul said with a smile that didn't quite meet her eyes. To capture, in case you haven't noticed. Villains without quirks are hard to come by. And wait a second, Verity blinked. What did you just say? You know what? Maybe this isn't Saul. Maybe this really is a lucid dream after all, because the Saul she's watched on television would never tell such a cruel joke. Making fun of her old lady words was one thing, but like I said, Saul said as her lips moved into a tight line. The last thing she wanted to do was info dump on this kid. But she was leaving the hero with little choice. You have a quirk now. Her head tilted towards the house for a second time. Now let's go inside so I can explain. You must be confused, Verity said as a hand moved to her chest. I'm quirkless, a southern nobody. You have no use for me. That's right, I'm powerful, quirkless. I will help. Can't help anybody. I'm a hero failure. Okay, kid, Saul huffed, pining for some AC. I'll explain a tiny bit, but then we're going inside. Got it. The woman was becoming annoyed with the brat that Greg had left her with. Is this really the one who's supposed to succeed him? Verity was just a kid, of course. Second Sight had seen her in his vision, which he had shared with Selector in the hour after her mentor's body was taken away. Saul went to Second Sight so she could see an image of the girl according to her memory. This girl, the one pouting like a toddler in front of her, was the one from the vision. Sheesh, this girl is going to make me go gray early, isn't she? Saul thought. Okay, Verity nodded and Saul loosed a breath. Yeah, Saul would have to pay extra attention to her head now. I hate to deliver this news so bluntly, Saul said grimly, trying not to choke on her words. Verity needed her to be strong right now. If Saul couldn't keep herself together, not only would the teen struggle alone, but her late mentor would probably haunt her for eternity. Saul was not about to let Greg talk to her about golf for the next 80 years or however long she lasted. She hated gold, and Greg knew it too. Selector is dead. For a moment, Verity's world spun around her. No, maybe it was falling under her. Out of all the things Saul could have told her, this was beyond anything the teen could have imagined. One of America's greatest heroes, Selector, was gone. What? Verity gasped. No, HEC can't be. There's no wa. It's true, Saul interrupted last night. News stations across the country showed only part of the fight between Selector and Negligence. The cameras had went out and Negligence died, as the HBC said, but Saul's hand went to her head. The woman had to process a lot of loss and new information. In the last 24 hours, Selector passed from his wounds shortly after I was with him when it happened. Verity sucked in a breath. Noting the sadness the hero's eyes carried, she recognized that look, the kind that leeches the color away and fills someone with emptiness. Grief is a parasite, one that never truly goes away. The gnawing feeling is still there long after, along with the scars. Her mind went back to the fight she'd watched the night before, because Mimi never cared for the fighting broadcast channels. Verity always watched alone, so the old lady had come running into the living room when Verity started screaming at the TV. At first, she thought there was something wrong with their connection. However, it wasn't long before Bob's voice let everyone know what had happened. Apparently, Negligence had used his power to short-circuit all cameras within a 10-mile radius, so everything had cut to black. The sound was still there, which made it easy to tell that Selector had won the fight, but no one would have guessed that he died. Verity felt sick. Selector was only second to Star and Stripe in America's list of top pro heroes. He had been a force to be reckoned with. The whole country will be in mourning soon. Her teeth clenched together. The coalition of heroes and citizens was probably scrambling to use his death as a way to convince people to join the Quirkmen. Of course, they would do that. She learned how they worked during that week of pure hell they put her through. Verity's heart dropped to her stomach. So, what does that have to do with me? She asked the hero, whose eyes were gleaming with a sheen of silver. There's something that no one, aside from a select few, knew about Selector's power before he died, Saul said, realizing the weight of the words as they left her lips. And I'm sorry, but it's a secret that you must carry from now on. She sputtered. Why me? What secret? The teen asked as her arms wrapped around her stomach. But Saul, who was battling her inner demons, didn't answer her. The hero's face was turned away, downcast. So Verity asked her again. This time her voice wasn't so soft. She could tell the hero was grieving her teacher, but Verity needed to know what kind of mess she was about to get into. What secret, Saul? Tell me, she demanded. After a moment, Saul slowly lifted her face. The hero wished she could have held back the tears, but she smiled at the future in front of her. No matter how this moment looked, even if her mentee was a small, teenage girl, that girl was the future. Saul would have to show Verity the light, so she could do the same for others. Saul pointed at her, and her smile didn't falter as she said, You, Verity Alice Ashford, are the chosen successor of Selector. The thing that hit you and lit up your arms like a firework was his quirk, which we called Power Drive. It's a special quirk that can be passed down, she said, and put her hand down, and he chose to pass it on to you. Her grin tightened as she said, Selector found out he would die before you received his power, so he designated me to teach you about Power Drive and train you to become a great hero like he was. A hero? Verity thought Selector chose me. Verity blinked at Saul. She blinked some more. There's more, Saul said quickly. She wasn't going to continue, but Verity's reaction prompted her to spill more. If your Mimi allows it, I plan to take custody of you. Part of your training will require us to live in Japan for a while. If I become your legal guardian, then it will make that process a lot easier for the both of us. Saul wasn't sure why, but part of Second Sight's vision included Verity fighting alongside other heroes in Japan. According to him, something bad was going to happen if Verity didn't go. Second had been persistent about that. While he refused to show Saul what bad thing would happen, he did say that the fate of the whole world was at stake. If she knew anything about Second, it was that the guy refused to mince words. Luckily for Saul, she had been a part of a student exchange program and trained with some heroes in Japan, so it wasn't too strange of a plan for her to create and follow. Plus, the heroes in Japan are on a completely different level, not to mention their standards of safety for teen heroes are comparably better there than the ones in the US. A minute passed by, but Verity hadn't said anything. Saul was beginning to worry that the girl would have a breakdown. She tried not to wince at the thought. Verity's history was the only troubling part of this whole ordeal. There are a lot of mental hurdles the girl will have to work through. Saul only hoped that she was up to the task, but this reaction was making her feel uneasy. Finally, Verity nodded and began walking towards the house before stopping abruptly. A wisp of a breeze blew through the teen's curls. Verity didn't turn her head to Saul. Instead, she looked down at her hands. I don't completely understand, but I know you're telling the truth. I can feel the power of this quirk inside of me. The girl's voice sounded affectionate as she said, It feels warm. Good, Saul answered, because the world needs you, Verity Alice Ashford. The girl didn't say anything but began walking again. Saul felt relieved as the two finally made their way to the air-conditioned home. All for one felt a shift in the universe. He wasn't sure what it was exactly, but one of his sensory quirks had been blaring for about half an hour now, and the villain wanted to know why. He had heard about Selector's death and thought it was a shame that a brilliant quirk like his had to fizzle out, or so he thought, because Quirk Search hadn't detected its departure. If it had died with Selector's death, then he would have noticed. He had taken notice of the hero after he had fought alongside All Might and other heroes in a battle that took place many years ago. A quirk that could do almost anything. That was something All for One had been very intrigued by. The only issue the villain had with it was its function. Calling out the names of powers seemed like a hassle back then, but now a phantom smile was all he could give as a pleasant thought crossed his mind. If this power truly is floating around, then All for One wanted it, unlike before, it would prove useful now. At those thoughts, the alarm under his skin settled down, but the truth was obvious enough. He needed to find that quirk and take it for himself. "Mimi, we have a guest," Verity yelled as she opened the door, dusting their shoes off on the mat. They walked into the kitchen. Verity's nerves were on the fritz. Her guest wasn't just anybody. Saul was a pro hero whom she'd looked up to ever since she was a kid. Saul was here, in the flesh. More importantly, the woman wanted to train Verity to become a great hero like Selector. Oh, and quirkless Verity now had a quirk. Yeah, that was another new fact she was processing, not to mention that her quirk was one that Selector had passed on to her specifically. Why Verity? Well, she wasn't sure. From what the teen had gathered, the hero, Second Sight, had a vision of her in his vision. She was the new holder of the power drive quirk that Selector had possessed, the power that now hummed in her bones. "A guest?" her Mimi asked in a surprised voice at this hour. "Oh, don't act so shocked," Verity thought. Verity led Saul into the living room, where Mimi sat in her recliner just like usual. She was watching some detective show. The TV was blaring at a volume that made the teen wince. Meanwhile, the old lady turned her head before standing up with a warm smile on her face. The woman can't bear to watch hero fights, but she will watch this garbage, Verity thought as the elderly woman paused her show. "Mimi, this is pro hero, Saul," Verity said as the two shook hands. The teen's eyes were wide as she still couldn't grasp this alternate reality she seemed to be living in. "Saul, this is Mimi." "Hello, ma'am, it's a pleasure to meet you," Saul said with a professional tone in her voice. "I apologize for the late visit, but I'm here on important business regarding your granddaughter. Could I have an hour of your time to talk?" "Again, I am sorry for the inconvenience." Mimi looked her up and down slowly before saying, "Oh, never mind the hour, it's only 8, and this old lady doesn't go to bed until 11. She shuffled towards the kitchen. "Make yourself comfortable while I fetch us a snack, okay?" The woman stopped abruptly and turned back with a smile. "And call me Mimi, dear. Everyone calls me Mimi." Her gaze moved to Verity, causing her smile to drop. "And you're covered in filth. Go get a shower real quick so the adults can talk for a while. Saul and I have much to discuss." "Yes, we do," the hero agreed. "You can join us when you are finished, Verity. There are still a lot of things you need to learn too." Still in shock, Verity gave a slight nod and headed for the shower. As she shampooed her hair, Saul's words continuously replayed in Verity's mind. How water trickled down her face, but the moment wouldn't wash away. But it still didn't feel real. Selector's successor. Verity spoke the words out loud to see if that would help, but it didn't change how she felt. Once she finished rinsing her hair, she brought her hands up to look at them. She felt the quirk, power drive, warm in her veins. How did Selector use it again? From what she recalled, all he had to do was call out the power he wanted to use. It was an incredible power with endless possibilities. But, like all heroes, Selector had moves that he favored over others. Verity moved her fingers and tried thinking of a simple power to try out. She moved her hand out, spreading her fingers apart, taking a deep breath through her nose. She then exhaled out of her mouth. "Might as well give it a shot, right?" Bracing herself, she shouted, "Water blast." But nothing happened. Maybe I didn't say it loud enough. "Water blast," she called out, demanding the power to obey. And again, nothing happened. "The heck?" Verity asked herself as she brought her hand back. "Maybe I should try picturing it." Moving her hand forward again, she yelled out, "Water blast." And, shocker, nothing happened. The water didn't even budge a centimeter. "I don't understand," she grumbled as she grabbed her bar of lavender soap. "Why didn't it work? Was she perfect defective?" Mimi brought a tray of cookies along with a cup of coffee to set on a small table by the couch. The old woman smiled as she gestured Saul to help herself. Before heading to her recliner, she turned the TV off, giving the hero her full attention. The old lady felt sad and happy. All at once, she had been waiting for this moment for about a week now. Intuition had alerted her on Wednesday, giving her more pieces of information as time went on. As soon as she found out, she began preparing herself, watching the hero sitting across from her. The old lady felt some peace too. This woman would be exactly what Verity needed to move on with her life. A parental figure, a mentor, and a friend. Saul really is the hero that girl needs, Mimi thought. Saul perked up a bit when she smelled the caffeinated drink. It had been a draining day, one that was far from over. This conversation with Verity's grandmother was not going to be an easy one. If Mimi agreed, Saul would be taking Verity away from her, not to mention that Verity would be dragged into hero work, which, with the quirk the girl had been given, would put her in the line of danger somehow. Saul needed to find a way to convince the old lady to let her take Verity. But Mimi's quirk has probably led her to a decision already, so if she says no. "You knew I was coming," Saul admitted out loud as she studied the coffee in her hands. "Why did you act so surprised?" Mimi chuckled warmly. "Honey, I don't have future sight. My quirk, intuition, only gives me a vague idea of what is going on around me. but it gives you nearly perfect intuition for someone you know well too, Saul said before taking a sip of coffee even if they are far away. If you have a close bond with that person, then your quirk can still give you some vague information about their current situation. True, but I just met you, she said back also. I take that knowledge with a grain of salt. It never gives me the whole story, only a part of it, so I need you to tell me everything. Her gaze moved towards the direction of the bathroom, where Verity had gone to shower, but go ahead and tell me the difficult parts without her here. Saul nodded, carefully placing her mug on the coaster. As you have probably learned, Verity has been given a special quirk. It has been passed down for generations. Selector's quirk? Mimi asked, unsurprised. Her lips were in a tight line. Yes, but it doesn't work in the way everyone was led to believe it did. I can explain more when Verity is here. She said what you need to know is that this quirk will cause powerful people to go after Verity regardless if she becomes a hero or stays a civilian. A villain will find out what she can do and will try to hurt her. She picked her cup back up. One sip of coffee was not going to cut it. Why Verity? Mimi asked her as the old lady folded her hands in her lap. Why was she given this ability? For starters, Saul said and took a drink. The quirk, Power Drive, can only be passed down to a quirkless person. As for why Verity was chosen specifically, Saul trailed off with a grimace. Mimi's face remained neutral as she said, "It's okay, go on." I'm not exactly sure, except that she had been seen in a vision. Selector has, or had been searching for a successor for a few years now. About 2 years ago, he asked Second Sight if he could see his successor. Saul rubbed her thumb around the rim of the mug. Second saw a vision of Verity fighting a villain with some other young heroes from Japan. He shared his vision with Selector, who wanted to seek her out immediately, but Second said it wasn't the right time and that I would be the one to train Verity. Taking another drink, Saul exhaled. We knew what that meant. Selector knew he would die before he could pass on Power Drive, so he prepared materials to leave behind for me and Verity. He wanted her to be ready to fight that terrible villain. In Second's vision, quick search was able to find her for us, which is how we got her name. As soon as Selector's body was removed from the scene of last night's battle, I booked my flight here. There was a moment of silence, and Saul picked up a cookie to nibble on while Mimi processed the information. It was a lot to take in. The first time Selector had told Saul the truth of his power, she barely believed it herself. Now here she was, trying to talk his successor's grandmother into letting her train the teen, and not just train her, but take her away too. While she had known it would happen soon, Saul had still pictured herself being much older. Before training Verity, she was only 28 years old, and now she might be responsible for taking care of and training a teenage hero while she was an adult. She was nervous to take on such a huge task. It's as I thought, Mimi concurred, breaking Saul away from her thoughts. And you want me to give you custody over her to make the process easier? Yes. Saul sucked in a breath. Yes, it will make getting her passport easier, among other minute details. Honey, you look young, she said, looking Saul up and down, not unkindly. Are you sure you're ready to become a parent? Because that's the role you will have to take on. I know you are confident in the mentorship role, but Verity is a teenager with a powerful quirk. She's sure to get herself into trouble, so you will have to parent her too. Saul paused. She hadn't thought of that. Being a mentor was one thing, but being a parent, that was another world entirely. Luckily, Saul had been a teacher at a hero school in New York City, so it wasn't like she didn't know how to manage teenagers. Still, being a parent meant that she would be responsible for Verity at all times. Saul would have to take care of a whole person. Weird, but not impossible. It won't be easy, Mimi spoke up. Verity can be I can do it, Saul said confidently. I could never replace Verity's mother, but I can become a good parental figure for her. I'm certain of it. Whether she was up for it or not, Selector had asked her to do this. Second had literally seen her do it. With so much at stake, Saul would take Verity on regardless. For the first time since they began talking, Mimi smiled softly. I figured as much, but I had to be sure. She leaned back in her recliner with a sigh. So, where is the paperwork? She picked up her purse, which had been sitting on the ground. Oh, and I better get to see my grandbaby. I might be relinquishing my custody, but it doesn't mean you get to hog her, hero. The lady winked as she began digging around her bag for a pen. Saul blinked in surprise before quickly saying, "Yes, ma'am." She picked up the briefcase that she had brought in and opened it up, pulling out the stack of documents. She placed them on a clipboard. Saul stood up and handed Mimi the clipboard, showing her where to sign. I will make sure that she's taken care of. Selector left his inheritance to her, which should be processed in a few days. It's enough to take off her comfortably until she's old enough to begin hero work herself. Don't worry, dear, Mimi assured her as her pen met paper. I believe you. I'll just miss her. The hero bit her lip. She'd read Mimi's file and knew her secret. How Saul checked her surroundings before she continued. How long do you have? Mimi smiled sadly. You read the file, so you already know. Maybe so, she confessed with a sigh, but I'd like to hear it from you if that's okay. The old lady put the pen down for a moment to scratch her head. Some loose gray strands came out of her bun in the motion. A year at best, she whispered, picking the pen back up. But please don't tell V. She'll need to be completely focused during her training with you. Saul's heart lurched in her chest. My lips are sealed. Hopefully, the teen would forgive her for it later. And she'll have to change therapists too. Mimi clicked her tongue, but I'm guessing you have that handled too. Oh. But her therapy services before you leave the country. Intuition tells me it won't help her in Japan for whatever reason. Saul answered with thought. Finding her a new therapist was one of the first things I did before hopping on the plane. As far as ending the service, I'll think about it, but I must ask, why is intuition telling you that? Doesn't therapy help you a lot? Mimi started. I know I said intuition gives me pieces, but sometimes it's extra sensitive when the matter is important. Simply imagining Verity receiving therapy after leaving the country is sending alarm bells through my mind. She reached her hand up to Saul's shoulder. Alarms like that usually mean danger, so please heed my words. Hero Verity cannot continue therapy in Japan, or it may hurt her more than help her. How strange, Saul thought. Why would intuition be against Verity's therapy? Wasn't the service helping her work through her problems? Still, she couldn't argue with the woman's quirk, saying, I will do as you say. Good. Mimi nodded with approval before licking her thumb to turn to the next page. And one more thing, dear, she said as she scribbled. Can you tell me your real name? Sure, the hero said, trying not to cringe. She hated her name. Okay, to be more specific, she hated her family's name. It's Liliana Garrison, but you can call me Leela. Saul mostly went by her hero name to avoid thinking about the family that was tied to her real one. Saul was a great hero who was respected and revered by many people. On the other hand, Leela Garrison was a disappointment. Well, Leela, Mimi said with a chuckle as she handed the clipboard back to her. She's your problem now. The two women laughed as Saul settled back on the couch for the next few minutes. They made pleasant conversation about hobbies and other trivial things as Verity stumbled into the room. With a blue towel wrapped around her head, she moved to sit down by Saul. So, did you guys have a good talk? Verity asked. Saul could tell the girl was nervous, so she smiled at her. We did, the hero said and lifted the paper to show Verity. And it looks like I'm your legal guardian now. Verity's eyes went wide as she took the papers in her hands. Saul had told her what she was doing, but she wasn't sure if Mimi would agree to it all. That was quick, the teen said as her gaze met Mimi's bright one. Well, the fate of the world is at hand. Mimi breathed as intuition has always told me. I know you'll do great things. Verity Alice Ashford, I do not doubt that Leela will mold you into an amazing hero. Verity turned her head towards Saul. Leela. My real name is Liliana Garrison. The hero said you can call me Leela, but only at home. Outside of the house, call me Saul. Verity nodded and handed the papers back to Leela. Now that you've two had your powwow, the teen said before wincing. Powwow was another term she'd picked up from Mimi lately. Can you tell me more about my quirk? I've already figured out that calling out names doesn't do anything. Leela crossed her arms and shook her head. Trying to use your power in the house. Remind me to set some ground rules once I explain all of this. The hero leaned back into the soft gray couch. Now, where do I begin? Just start from the beginning, dear, Mimi piped up. Right, Leela agreed and turned towards Verity. Like you, Greg Holston was born quirkless until he was given power drive. This quirk has been passed down from host to host, and you are the 12th holder. The first holder, Alicia Smith, was born with a weaker version of this power, but he found a way to pass it down during TAPS. TAPS, or the American Power Struggle, took place when quirks first began appearing throughout the world. During that time, President Sam Wendell was nearly killed by someone with a quirk, which almost started a civil war. Villains began rising in the country, and they tried making their leader retaliate. The new president, thankfully, a group of heroes rose and put a stop to it, and the incident was later named TAPS. Alicia, better known as Eagle, died during the Battle of Chicago, Leela said before his heart stopped. He was able to pass down power drive to his sidekick, Claw. The problem was that Claw's body couldn't hold his quirk and power drive. It was slowly killing him, and he almost figured it out too late. Thankfully, he found his successor before he passed. Who was his successor? Verity asked curiously. Leela shrugged. We're not sure, if I'm being honest. Some of this story would be conjecture if your predecessors hadn't found evidence for it. Eagle had left behind a diary, which was found by Greg, Selector's master, Free Spirit. From what Selector told me, Free Spirit wanted to learn more about Power Drive's origins since there was a lot of peace during his time. He spent most of it researching and training Selector. Verity's lip twitched as Greg was that Selector's real name. Yes, his name was Greg Holston. And he was an incredible hero through and through. Leela smiled sadly, thinking about her mentor. No pressure, but you have a lot to live up to, kid. Anyways, Power Drive allows its holder to craft or copy quirks that can be stored in your fingers and thumbs. It takes a lot of energy, but the holder can switch out powers whenever they want to. Verity looked down at her hands, flipping them back and forth with amazement. Waya, seriously? Yep. Of course, there are plenty of drawbacks if you choose to create a quirk. Then you have to craft it in your mind carefully. Leela chuckled. Greg told me that the first power he tried to craft was electricity. He didn't think to make his body shock absorbent, and he nearly fried himself trying to use it. Verity winced. I think it would be better to start with copied quirks then, right? Yes, Leela agreed, and Greg also had rules for himself when it came to his powers. The first rule was to only exchange one power every 24 hours unless an emergency required him to change more than one in a short amount of time. As I mentioned before, exchanging a power will drain your energy very quickly, which would only hurt you in battle. Your fingers are void of power now, and I want you to keep it that way until we carefully choose which ones you should start with. She paused, rubbing her temples before her eyes widened. Oh, but the first upload to each finger won't drain you. However, once that first 10 have been activated, you will find that exchanging them is exhausting. Oh, and I was hoping to test it tonight, Verity whined as she wriggled her fingers. Shush and listen, Mimi scolded the teen. You have a lot to learn, and the hero knows best. Anyway, it's dark outside, Leela said as her eyes shifted towards the window. And no powers in the house, remember. Now, let's move on to the second rule. According to Greg's notes, you need to store your most important quirks on fingers that are less likely to. Her gaze met Mimi's, and the old lady nodded for her to continue. You need to store important quirks on fingers that you're less likely to lose. For example, Greg kept regeneration on his ring finger because he felt it was safest. The ring finger is on the left hand, and Greg was right-handed, so he kept most of his base quirks on his left hand except one or two in case he ended up losing his left hand completely. That's pretty smart, Verity said with a hand going to her chin. I would have never thought of that, but could he not store his powers in other parts of his body? Wouldn't that be a better failsafe? Unfortunately, Greg could never figure that out. He was close to putting one in his tongue once, Leela said with a shiver, but the quirk never quite reached it. I wonder if I could figure it out, Verity wondered aloud. Not to dash your hopes, but I doubt you could, Leela remarked. But let's table this part of our conversation for later. We can discuss more facets of your quirk when your training begins next week. Speaking of your training, we need to discuss the next steps of this process. Ah, Mimi breathed, slumping in her chair. You're taking her away sooner than I thought. What? Verity asked her and turned to the hero. What is she talking about? Well, Leela said hesitantly, I have arrangements for us to go to Maine and train for a while. Verity shifted in her seat. That was pretty far away. Not as far as Japan, but still, why Maine? Good question. There's a special training facility that pro heroes can reserve to train their mentees or hold classes. It was a pain in the butt to get a reservation for 9 months, but I pulled some strings to make it work. The place is right on the coast, and it's on the outskirts of a cute town that has some shops and restaurants. I think you'll find the fresh sea air to be helpful while discovering the inner workings of your quirk. Leela remembered when Greg took her up there shortly after he hired her. She had learned a lot during that intensive 2-week training. The first 3 days had nearly killed her and her spirit, but it wasn't long before Leela began to understand why Greg was pushing her so hard during those weeks. Leela's quirk had awakened in a new way. If Greg hadn't taken her to that place, then she might have never learned how to use her quirk in full darkness. It was that small town, Rockford, that had changed everything for her as an up-and-coming hero. And now, at the young age of 28, she would take her mentee to that peaceful place. Leela only hoped that Verity would find the same kinds of solace and revelation at that campground. We will train there before heading to Japan. Leela continued, there you will be attending the top hero school in Japan, UA. Why Japan? There are plenty of great schools here in the US, the teen said, because of Second Sight's vision. Leela reminded her, you will be fighting a terrible villain alongside Japanese heroes. Villain? Verity blurted the question but was ignored. But that could be at any point in time. Mimi countered, why have her go through all of that trouble for one fight? Leela silently clasped her hands together. These two were an inquisitive pair, weren't they? Another great question. Leela acknowledged, I figured it all out when I decided to visit Second and asked him to see if he could find out any more information about her future. He told me that he saw Verity getting into UA with Selector's recommendation letter, which, by the way, I found in record speed and made copies of for safekeeping anyway. He said that the villain she and the other heroes will face. As her face fell as she sighed, worse than negligence or retaliate. Worse? Mimi's eyes widened in fear, and Leela began to see the sting of regret hit her face before the woman regained her composure. Leela grimaced, much worse. Okay, but will we win? Verity asked loudly. Will we beat the villain? The women whipped their heads around. Oh, Leela trailed off. Second couldn't see that far into it. Oh, my, Mimi gasped, clutching her pearls. If intuition wasn't reassuring me right now, then I'd rescind everything. If it's any consolation. Leela began. Second said that Verity's presence alone made their team stronger than the villain. The hero's gaze moved back to Verity. Japan? No. The world needs you, Verity. If that villain wins, then he has great potential to conquer the world. That's why we need to begin your training as soon as possible. Of course, we're going to work on getting your passport, visa, and UA application, and first you won't be attending until next spring. But we should get started on that process now. You're supposed to take a few different tests to get in, but UAS principal owed Selector a favor, so we'll be cashing in on that to get you in using his recommendation instead. And if that doesn't work, Verity squeaked out anxiously. Oh, trust me, Leela said with a huge grin, it will work. Principal Nedzu is one of the few people Greg trusted with his secret. Of course, you will still have to complete a physical test. But you will pass that no problem once I explain everything to Nezu over the phone. It should all play out smoothly. Good, Verity said with a nod but paused. Wait a second, we have a problem. Leela blinked. What problem? I don't know a lick of Japanese. Verity groaned. How am I supposed to communicate? Or do homework? Leela grinned again before snatching Verity's hand. Hey, the teen yelped. That's an easy fix. Leela assured her. You'll do it the same way Selector did. You'll use the language quirk that he crafted and instantly learn it before we leave, huh? That guy. He had to make another version of that quirk so I could learn Japanese too. Does that mean you went to UA? Verity asked as she tugged her hand away. No, my exchange program was with Ketsubutsu Academy also. Your spot won't be through an exchange program. You, Verity, will be a full-fledged UA student. Leela punched her fist in the air. Verity needed some positivity after hearing about Second's vision. You will get even better training than I did. Picking up a cookie from the table, Leela took a bite before muffling. I've been working on getting us a nice apartment in the city to stay in, so you'll be well taken care of while you train. Really, she had been working on the apartment thing for a while. Leela loved going to Japan. The citizens loved Saul, and most of the heroes were nice too. Cool, Verity said with a smile. But remember that Japan isn't happening for a while since their school terms are different there. Plus, it's your last year of middle school anyways, so tomorrow you need to start packing your things for Maine. We will leave on Friday and start training and homeschooling on Monday. Homeschooling? Verity groaned. Summer just started. Well, they go to school year-round, and their terms begin in April, so you're going to homeschool and play catch-up, Leela said and smiled brightly. But I'll make sure you have time to rest and have fun. I wouldn't want my mentee to burn out in her first few months of training. Leela wanted to take Sat and move into their temporary home and use Sunday for exploring the city. It would be good for the two of them to get to know each other a little before things get too serious that way. Leela could get a good grasp on how to go about Verity's training. Selector had left some pointers for her as far as the first week went, but that was it. The pro hero was on her own now, and she didn't want to lead her new mentee blindly. We should go shopping for some new activewear, Mimi suggested to Verity. You will need it. Oh, you don't have to. Leela had begun, but Mimi shot her a look. It was one that Selector had given her a few times. Leela had planned to tell the old lady that Verity's clothes would be taken care of, but it didn't take a genius to understand why. Woman stopped her. Of course, Mimi wants an excuse to spend some extra time with her granddaughter. After all, Verity would be on the other side of the country in a few days. This would be their last chance to spend time together. Good idea, Verity exclaimed. I could really use some new tennis shoes. The old lady beamed at her granddaughter before secretly mouthing, "Thank you," to the hero. Leela nodded before heaving herself off the couch. Picking up her briefcase, she said, I'll be going now. There is some work I need to do at the hotel I'm staying at. Verity, I'll be here to get you around 5 on Friday. Okay. The teen's eyebrow quirked up as the hero made her way to the exit. That's a little late, isn't it? Huh? Leela chuckled as she twisted the doorknob. Oh, I don't mean Friday evening, I mean 5 in the morning on Friday. I'm sorry, Verity blurted out. Leela smirked. Better get used to it, kid. The hero waved at them. See ya then. As Saul closed the door behind her, Verity slowly turned to her grandmother. Her eyes pleaded with Mimi, causing the old lady to sigh. She didn't need intuition to know what her granddaughter wanted to ask her. Don't worry, she remarked. I'll make sure you're up and at 'em. Verity exhaled. Thank you, Mimi. That night, Verity could hardly sleep. A hero. Verity was going to become a great hero. 9 months later, Verity rushed over to the large window of the apartment, or she should say penthouse. While she never had the chance to visit Leela's home in Washington, Verity wondered what it was like compared to this. The hero had told Verity not to expect anything fancy, but this was insane. She studied the incredible view of the city that she would soon grow accustomed to. The Musutafu skyline was beautiful in daylight, and she was sure that it was more magical during the night. And this isn't fancy, Verity sputtered out as her hands pressed into the glass. Their new home was modern and chic, which was so different from the rustic one that she had grown up in. An elevator had taken them directly to their new home. As they entered the kitchen, Verity couldn't help but go wide-eyed at the sleek back kitchen cabinets and appliances that probably cost more than her Emmy's entire house. Okay, that might be an exaggeration, but the place was insane. The open kitchen led into a spacious living room that had an electric fireplace, a huge flat-screen TV, and long couches that looked as if they had never been touched. But the icing on the cake was the windows that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. To her right was a black staircase, which she guessed the bedrooms must be. What would hers look like? Leela had asked about her preferences and hobbies to get an idea for the design of it. The hero had told her she hired designers to fix up the place, but she hadn't been imagining anything so luxurious for the past 2 months. She thought her room would be similar to the cabin one she had been living in. Verity had pictured a simple space with a small closet and twin bed. Now she was sure that it was far grander than that. Hey, stop that. Leela scolded her. The glass might be bulletproof, but it's not V-proof. Verity couldn't help the smile that crept up on her lips. Her guardian had given her the new nickname during her first week of training, and it stuck. She didn't mind it since it helped her move on from what she now considered her old life, the one of quirkless Verity. "Ha, true," the teen said, recalling all of the times Leela had to request maintenance for the cabin. Thankfully, it wasn't treated as a big deal since it was a part of the hero training camp. And anyway, she looked around and shrugged with a smile. "I've seen better." Truthfully, Leela had planned to get them a simple apartment, until she realized that Verity's power would accidentally destroy it during their time in Maine. The girl had broken the door of their cabin at least 7 times. No, 8. She had tried talking Verity into replacing the strength quirk with something less destructive, but she refused eventually. Leela gave up trying to convince her after all. There were more important battles that Leela needed to win when it came to Verity's quirk. The girl could act a little reckless from time to time. Teaching Verity how to hold back her power was more of a challenge than getting her to release it. Her mind wandered back to the first power Verity chose. They spent the first 3 months of training to establish the 5 quirks. These core quirks were the important ones that couldn't be changed. This rule was one of the first ones Selector had established in his notes. The core quirks: Strength, Restore, Fight Style, Speed, and Shield didn't take long for Verity to grasp. Once the teen was able to use them well enough, Leela allowed her to store a quirk of her choosing. "So, have you decided what quirk you want first?" Leela asked her. "It's a big decision." Greg always shared the memory of choosing his first power with a smile on his face. The ocean breeze whipped through her blonde hair as she laughed. Of course, he chose Flight. Strength and Flight had been his favorite quirks to wield. Verity's gaze moved toward the deep blue waves that crashed against the rocky cliff. "I've always known what quirk I wanted. Well, it's more like a combination of quirks that I wrapped up into one." "No." Leela's eyes went wide as she shook her head. "We've talked about this. No created quirks to start with. Choose a copy of one he made or copy one from another hero." "Don't worry," Verity said with a smile as she cracked her knuckles. "I've studied his books on quirk analysis and creation, and I'm pretty sure I know what I'm doing. Heck, I even used the worksheet to be safe." Her eyes moved to the ground slyly. "Not that it was necessary," she mumbled. "I said no," Leela said sternly as the teen took a deep breath and closed her eyes. "I'm serious, Saul," she replied calmly, calling the woman by her hero name. "I've worked on this for months, and I'm sure it will work without any major drawbacks. I even thought to design some resistance to protect my body." "Resistance?" the hero asked, confused before it dawned on her. "Have you lost your mind? One of Greg's rules was to forego elemental quirks in the beginning. Those were the most difficult ones to craft." "You mean," Verity said as a blue glow surrounded her body, "they were the most difficult ones for Selector to craft?" The young girl opened her eyes, which were glowing in that same royal blue color. Leela nearly gasped. Greg's eyes had glowed a light yellow when he stored his quirk, but it never made her physically shudder. The power radiating off of Verity was on a whole other level. Greg had told her that PD becomes more powerful as it's passed down, but Leela could feel it, and this was more than a small increase in power. Verity, if trained well, would have the potential to become the strongest hero in the world. "Really, Leela," the teen said as she studied the pointer finger on her right hand. "I've got this." Her finger glowed bright blue, imprinting a symbol on it in the same color before vanishing entirely. Whenever the holder of power drive stores a quirk, a symbol representing the quirk appears on its designated finger before disappearing. In that case, the mark was a cursive T. As part of storing a quirk, the holder gets to decide on the symbol so they can keep track of it. Really, Leela shouldn't be able to see the symbols at all, but Greg had given her the ability to see them. He had figured it would be useful for training his successor, and he was right. It was alarming how Power Drive had allowed him to use his abilities on people. It had helped Leela learn Japanese in seconds and allowed her to see the marks PD made on its holder. Additionally, the quirk could do that without having lasting negative effects on its holder. That's another reason why Power Drive is so dangerous. Leela thought if someone knew that she could delve out powers like that to others, then Verity would face bigger problems than the UA exams that she had to take. Since she could do it without it permanently affecting her quirk, someone might try taking advantage of her, someone who might use her as their cash cow. Sure, other quirks could help others in similar ways, but Power Drive provided endless possibilities. However, there was once one scary thought that one of the previous holders had written down and passed on. It was an impossible concept, but it was scary enough to make the past wielder of Power Drive hold their secrets close to their chests, to the point where the woman lived like a hermit until she died. Because, with the quirk becoming more powerful, what if there were new things it could do? What if it could create and pass quirks to others? Leela shook her head. It was a ridiculous fear. The past holder couldn't even find a way to channel Power Drive, which they believed would let them store more powers in other parts of their body, not to mention that there were quirks even they couldn't copy and create. What made them think that creating and passing quirks was a possibility? But as Leela had watched Verity on the beach that day, dread had crawled and settled in her stomach. A serious expression crossed V's face. This is the quirk I will use while I'm at UA, and it's special to me for many reasons, she said as her glowing gaze died down. I call it 12 first, because it's a combination of 12 quirks that I chose. The pro hero gasped. 12 quirks? You created a quirk with that many powers? You're insane, Leela shouted. Creating that thing could have killed you. Verity's face remained neutral. Saul was more likely to kill her in this case. I knew the risks, but I was confident that I wouldn't fail. Selector's formula was explained down to the tiniest detail. I finished creating this quirk a month ago after checking it over about 100 times. The pro hero blinked at the girl. She knew V was smart, but this was incredible. The girl continuously proved that she was rightfully chosen as the successor of PD. She felt a sense of pride but swallowed it down. The hero couldn't praise her in the middle of scolding her. Okay, Leela drawled. So, what's the second reason for calling it 12? Verity's face lit up with a smirk as she said, I named it after myself after all. I am Power Drive's 12th holder. Leela sighed, pushing a loose strand of golden hair behind her ears. This girl was a bold one, and she knew Greg would have loved her. Well, that's Leela coughed and continued. Anyways, won't a quirk like that make each element weaker? Sort of, V said and rubbed the back of her neck. Part of it depends on my energy, which restore should help with now. Output and range are a different story. Let's see, she said as she began pacing. How do I explain this? After a moment, she stopped and turned towards Leela. Okay, for example, someone with a fire quirk can release so much fire at once across a wide range depending on their output. But all of their output, 100%, is focused solely on fire. Meanwhile, someone who has a quirk composed of two elements, let's say a mix of water and fire, would have their total output split between the two elements, so both water and fire would function at 50% output. Of course, the total output of each person's quirk is directly correlated to the strength and power they have. Someone with a weak fire quirk would easily get defeated by someone with a stronger mixed quirk. Because of that correlation, you get the picture, right? Okay, Leela said, taking a deep breath as she thought about it. Her brain was starting to hurt. So, if I'm understanding this correctly, a one-element quirk functions at 100% power output, and for a two-element quirk, each one functions at 50% power output. Pretty much it helps to view a person's body as a storage space, and each facet of their quirk takes up a certain percentage of that storage. V nodded. In the case of Power Drive, each finger acts like a flash drive with a storage of 100%. Technically, power output does not make up the total 100% of the storage space. Really, it takes up about 75% for 12. I had to divide that 75% among the elements and then divide the facets of it within their percentages. It's not too hard though. I can treat the output percentage as a whole before splitting it up, which helps. You lost me at the percentages thing, but I think I get the rest of it. Leela winced as she rubbed her temples. Sorry, it is kind of complicated even though I could have done without it. I'll admit that Selector's quirk formulation worksheet is pretty great. It helped me keep track of everything easily enough. She looked up to the sky and stared at the clouds that were rolling, and a storm was sure to come later, which meant that Leela was going to squeeze in an extra homeschool lesson. If V hadn't been so focused on her education before meeting the pro hero, then she might not have caught up in her studies. But I wonder. The teen trailed off, looking back down on her hands. Wonder what? Leela asked, placing her hands on her hips. If the storage will grow, she said and wriggled her fingers. As I get stronger, which will make everything else, including my power output, well, stronger. Leela's left eye had twitched at that moment, which had never been a good sign. Anytime that happened, chaos was sure to follow. As strong as she hoped Verity would become, the potential of Power Drive scared her. It scared her because if Verity lost control, then she could be hurt. And you're sure that this is the quirk you want to present to the world? She asked her. It sounds like it will be difficult to manage so much at once. V shook her head, positive it may be diverse, but that's a good thing. Trust me, I've put a lot of time and thought into this. Okay, but remember not to come crying to me if you want to change it. Leela huffed. I might bend a little on this one, but you will not make any exchange for a year. We don't need the students and staff at UA to get suspicious. Plus, you ought to master the first 10 you choose before trying anything else. I don't want you getting yourself killed by a villain because you can't use your quirks right. A huge grin crept on Verity's face, and she nodded. Her eyes didn't leave the freshly minted finger. Fair enough. So, Leela said with a sigh, which elements did you give the most power? Now, splitting the power storage between the elements was tricky. Verity acknowledged. I may go back and tweak the numbers later. I'll have to remove it, but it won't technically count as an exchange since it's just an updated version of the quirk anyway. I gave the 4 basic elements about 125% of power output, and I gave lightning close to 10%. The other 7 get close to 6% each. The numbers seem pretty low, but really, it's enough for me to use the basic ones pretty powerfully, and I gave more to lightning because it could be useful for a variety of things, including short-circuiting anyone who might have a tech quirk. The others will be a little weaker, but should come in handy if I need them. Oh, and I have an idea for a special move for lava. I wonder if... Whoa, kid, Leela said as she pinched the bridge of her nose. You're doing that rambling thing again. Oh, Verity said sheepishly. Sorry. I'm still working on breaking the habit. Mr. Johnson says I have made a few improvements during our sessions. Good, Leela said as she stared out at the vast expanse of the sea. Verity's first nightmare had occurred 1 week after training began. Well, it was the first nightmare the teen had in Leela's custody. Mimi had warned the hero, but it was much more concerning than she thought. That's why Leela found Verity a therapist, who seemed to be helping the girl work through her deep-seated trauma that stemmed from the death of her family. The hero fought back a grimace as she watched the teen look at the surrounding city. Hey, kid, why don't you check out your room and get settled? I'll order us some food. She walked over to the open kitchen, where a few restaurant pamphlets sat on the counter. There are a few restaurants in this building that are supposed to be pretty great. Ooh, I know. She held up a colorful pink paper. How about we get some ramen? Oh, that sounds perfect, the teen said, rushing over to sit at a bar stool. What kinds do they have? I'd like to order tonkatsu ramen, the hero said. Licking her lips, she handed the menu to Verity, who began reading the description of the dish. It had been too long since she'd had a meal in Japan, and she had been looking forward to this moment more than anything else. That sounds good to me, Verity said and tossed the pamphlet back onto the counter. They have gyoza too, so I'll order some of those to go with it. Leela picked it up and flipped through it again. Oh, and melon soda too. Trust me when I say it's the best. Sure, Verity replied dully. A faraway look was in her eyes, and Leela knew what that meant. Hey, kiddo, I know it's a lot to take in, the hero breathed. Are you doing all right? If not, maybe I can convince Nezu to postpone the exam. I'm fine. Leela's brow quirked up and Verity rolled her eyes. I promise that I'm okay, really. Leela, her eyes shifted towards the window, and she grabbed her arm. I'm just nervous about tomorrow, that's all. Well, you shouldn't be, she replied bluntly. We both know you're ready for this. We both know you've got the written in the bag since you're wicked smart. Plus, you have experience in the field. That's one advantage you'll have over everyone else. As for the interview, Nezu promised it would be a casual conversation between the two of you. Of course, you'll need to play the part in front of parents, but you'll be fine. Leela's words were true. The written exam and interview should both go just fine. While she had plenty of experience shadowing Saul in the field, it was the physical exam she was nervous about. But she shouldn't be nervous. The United States doesn't have as many restrictions when it comes to young heroes. So Verity spent a good part of the past 9 months walking patrols with Saul. During that time, Verity had helped fight and capture a few minor villains and criminals. Nothing too dangerous, however. Saul had refused to let her tag along during the major fights, which was a bummer. True, but the other candidates might have the advantage of knowing their opponents, which means they will know what they are up against. What if I don't make the cut? She swirled the stool around in an attempt to steel her nerves. Seriously? Leela asked with a hint of annoyance in her voice. Nezu's already accepted you into the school. The tests are just a formality so other candidates and their parents don't complain. While the pro hero had originally said that Verity would be exempt from the tests, she was quickly proven wrong. One meeting with Nezu later, and Verity learned that she would be put through the tests after all. Of course, Nezu had sworn on his late great-grandmother for whatever weird reason that she would be accepted no matter what, but still. And that's another thing. What if I absolutely suck? Everyone will complain if I fail and still get in. Verity clenched her fist. Even if they had already accepted her on selector's favor, she still wanted to earn her spot. Leela shook her head with a knowing smile. That's not possible. Verity crossed her arms. What do you mean? Of course, it's you, the hero said and pointed straight at Verity. Are the most powerful kid hero I've ever seen. I have total faith in you. Maybe your faith is misplaced, she muttered. Oh, come on, Leela shouted as she threw her hands up. But the smile hadn't left her face. Where's that brat who confidently said, I've got this, when she went against the rules and created a whole new quirk by herself? And not just any quirk, but one with 12 stupidly amazing powers. She reached over the counter and gave Verity's shoulder a light shove. Spoiler alert. It was you. She laughed lightly and ruffled Verity's brown curls. Geez, V, for someone so smart, you can act like such a dummy. Ugh, stop. She pushed her hand away. Anyways, I didn't do it by myself. Selector gave me his notes to help me. And how old was he when he created a quirk for the first time? Leela asked, putting her hands on her hips. Verity, feeling embarrassed, swiveled around to hide her face. He was 25. And how old are you? Verity asked playfully. 15, she nearly whispered. Exactly. You're like a genius to have figured it out so quickly. Leela pulled at her phone, ready to order the ramen she craved. Look, kid, you're the youngest person to ever receive Power Drive and have accomplished more in 9 months than most of the previous holders did. It also. Give yourself some credit. The hero waved her hand at her. Now go upstairs and take a look at your room. It should be the last door at the end of the left hallway. Your stuff will be there too since we sent it here last week with Vortex's help. Okay, Verity replied as she swirled back around and hopped out of her seat. Leela smiled as she typed in the order on her phone. It had been a pain to keep the secret of the penthouse from V. The teen had worked her butt off the past year and deserved a nicer accommodation, not to mention she needed to relax a little. At first, Leela thought the girl would whine about her room in Maine, Thinking she would raise hell over it, she also figured Verity would be difficult to train. Granted, their days weren't always a walk in the park. However, V was dedicated to her new role as a rising hero, and she worked constantly. After Leela had found out about 12, she figured out that V had been losing rest every night to create it. She had scolded the girl for it, but it didn't do any good. V continued to work on creating quirk formulas late into the night, so Leela was forced to implement and enforce a curfew for the kid. The last thing she needed was her pupil collapsing from fatigue. If she hadn't made such stupid assumptions, then she might have sprung for a better room for the kid. Then again, it was probably a good thing she roughed it for a while, otherwise Verity would have become spoiled. And spoiled heroes suck. Leela knew that from experience. Heck, she had been like that before Greg had taken her under his wing. Again, Leela was happy that V was committed and hard-working, but she couldn't let her mentee burn out. Hopefully, their cool new home would help her loosen up. The hero hoped that the teen would make plenty of friends too. She would definitely need the support. Going up the stairs, Verity proceeded to take the left hallway. Its white walls were painted with black curved lines. Meanwhile, the right hallway was the exact opposite, as it had black walls that and straight white lines painted across it. She wondered why the artist had made them so different, but pushed the thought aside as she approached the door to her room. Once she opened it, V flipped the light on and gasped. The bedroom was easily 20 times bigger than the one she had in Maine. The furthest wall was a smaller copy of the windows in the living room. Stretching from floor to ceiling, the walls were painted in space gray, and a few prints and objects hung on the walls. She quickly spotted a framed poster of the hero Hawks, smiling as a blush crept into her cheeks. That was definitely Leela's doing. They had gushed over the young hero too many times to count, shipping him with other heroes. Beside the tall windows was a huge bed, which she guessed might be a queen. The navy blue comforter on it looked soft and plush, and there were so many pillows covering the headboard that Verity couldn't count them without losing track. Beside the bed was a tall ladder, which led to a loft from where she was standing. Verity could just make out a reading nook and what appeared to be several shelves of books. Some of them, she realized, were the notebook Selector had left behind for her to study. To the right of the door was a black desk that had a full PC setup with 3 monitors, a tablet, and some fancy headphones. On the left was a space where a large projector screen hung on the wall. Beside it was a shelf that held different video games and their respective consoles and controllers. A nice futon sat in front of the screen, sandwiched between 2 matching recliners, but Verity quickly took note of the mini fridge that sat beside it, which seemed to be filled with all kinds of drinks. But the icing on the cake was in the bit of space that separated the gaming area from her bedroom. She knew her eyes were sparkling as she rushed towards the air hockey table, grinning like a hyena. She needed to make some friends that she could obliterate in a game. Breathing as she picked up a peculiar-looking remote, she wondered if she would be able to make friends at her new school. She didn't have a big group of friends in Texas, and she could count the number of Louisiana friends she made using 2 fingers, so her friendship track record hadn't been great. And being quirkless wasn't the entire problem. Despite her upbeat personality, Verity was quite the introvert per her therapist's instructions. She did her best to balance her outings and alone time. Right now, she was under her outings quota. Pressing the center button of the remote, she was shocked when a menu screen appeared on the windows. She read it in delight, realizing that she could change her view with the press of a button instead of curtain. The windows had different modes to give her more or less privacy. There are also options for different views entirely, and some of them had sound effects as a jungle scene played on them. She learned that her room had surround sound. Then she noticed 2 other doors in her room. One was by her bed, which ended up being a walk-in closet that was full of unfamiliar clothes. As she looked through them, she discovered they were arranged by type. Casual wear was closer to the front, while formal wear was in the back. A royal blue dress with a ruffled skirt caught her eye. "Where in the hell would I wear this?" she muttered as she rubbed the material between her fingers. Once she finished the tour of her closet, Verity moved on to the next mystery room, which was a bathroom. The color scheme was the same as her bedroom to her right. A huge, matte black tub was in the back corner, and it had jets. A few containers with salts, bath bombs, and other bath products sat on a cart, ready to be used. The matching shower was double the size of the one in the cabin, and it had a huge shower head. After taking a closer look, she learned that it had different settings too. On her left, the wall was just one big mirror with 3 sets of sinks underneath it. Why she needed so many, she didn't know. But the odd appliance was the toilet, which had a bidet. Verity knew what it was, but she had no idea how to use it. Thankfully, she noticed a few rolls of toilet paper on the side. Her mentor really had thought of everything. "Good grief," she said as she collapsed on the bed with a groan. The mattress was so much better than her old one in the cabin. I can safely say that Saul went overboard this time. But the grin didn't leave her face as she left to explore the rest of the house. Rock on. The written part of the recommendation test is over. The practical's next. And finally, the interview. Present, Mike shouted as everyone walked to the examination area. From what Verity could see, it included a rock wall, a fake city, a path with spikes, and many other hazards. However, the teen felt that most of that stuff was an illusion to trick the examinees most likely. The course would be pretty straightforward and more like a race than anything else, even if those obstacles weren't fake. Verity was sure she could handle them all just fine during her short fights with villains in Maine. She had to maneuver around plenty of barriers. They didn't stop her then, and they surely wouldn't stop her now. President Mike continued, "You'll go 6 at a time for the practical. Get steppin' when your number's called. The exam will be a 3-kilometer race. But it's an obstacle course, so you can't just run straight through it. Use your quirks to reach the finish," the hero said as he pointed to the sky. He continued to give further directions and information. But Verity had a hard time paying attention to the man. But not his hair. Did the guy have to use an entire jar of hair gel every day? Or did his sound quirk permanently cause his hair to stand up like that? The issue perplexed Verity, and she hoped to get an answer for it one day. But the hero's hair wasn't her only distraction. She had other things on her mind. The main one is the written test. Surprisingly, it had left Verity confused and kind of pissed. She had put countless hours into studying for the written test just for it to be one single question. From what she had researched, it should have been at least 70 questions, if not more. Nezu, using his quirk, High Specs, which makes him extremely intelligent, designs the written test every year. When compared to the complex materials she had spent months cramming into her brain, the actual test felt stupid to her. The teen had been so shocked that she almost broke exam protocol when she read the question to herself. Write a paragraph to answer the following question. Why do you want to become a hero? Why that question? She thought to herself, biting her nails as she zoned out. The question hadn't even been in the study materials she used to prepare these past few months after Nezu had sent all of it to her. She routinely used the practical guide to prep for the test. Did he trick her on purpose? Was this one of those tests of character or something? Although Verity was pretty sure crap like that only happened in movies. Then again, UA's infamous principal was known for his love of chaos apparently. He liked to use his intelligence to screw with everyone. Well, at least that's what Saul had told her while she hadn't been a student at UA. She had made a few friends there, and they had told her countless stories of the guy, or creature. She should just stick with principal. But oh man, that kind of intelligence had led her to try creating a similar quirk plenty of times. However, figuring out a formulation for such a power was complicated. It wasn't quite like the language quirk that she had stored to learn. Japanese language was easy to copy and store, and it didn't drain her when she removed it either. However, High Specs was much more complex, and she hadn't been able to copy the quirk. That's why she was trying to create a knowledge quirk. But if the quirk wasn't fashioned carefully, then it could flood her brain and kill her. Verity needed to figure out a way to contain the knowledge in a way that could be filtered slowly to her brain at will. This wouldn't be a problem if knowledge wasn't such a vast and ever-growing thing. So, Selector's formula worksheet couldn't compute it. Plus, Power Drive has a large storage, but being divided among her fingers puts limitations on what she could store. Hopefully, she could expand the storage to allow her quirks to expand and become stronger too. Still, the teen thought that Nezu himself might know of a way to store an intelligence quirk. Then she could safely adapt it and avoid unintentionally overloading herself to death. Now that she thought about it, the principal could most likely improve all of her quirk formulas, selectors too. If so, then Nezu could help her make 12 perfect while it was already safe to use and decently powerful. Verity knew her special quirk could become better, more refined. There were too many limitations to how she could produce and manipulate the elements. Many nights, Verity had spent many nights trying to think of a way to break those barriers and unleash the full potential of 12. The teen had come up with a few ideas, but each one fell apart when she went to tweak the quirk. In frustration, she had thrown her head against her desk more than once, from creating a quirk to removing it. The processes of Power Drive are all done in the holder's head. Designing is the most complicated one as it requires a lot of concentration. Copying most quirks is relatively easy since she could read everything out of a notebook or watch a documentary. Meanwhile, storing, removing, and exchanging drains a lot of energy since Power Drive itself is activated. Meanwhile, using stored quirks affects her energy slightly less than those with similar powers. That's why she needed to strengthen PD. Verity was already a level above the minor heroes, so if she could store quirks with enough power, stop any villain and save every innocent. If Selector's words were true, and Power Drive grew stronger with each holder, then she could become unstoppable. No one, not even the greatest pro heroes, would be a match for her. Not even close. In that case, saying she was overpowered would be an understatement. Stopping any villain and saving every innocent, that's why Verity wanted to be a hero. The girl refused to watch anyone else she cared for die so senselessly. She clenched her fist tightly, but carefully. If she wasn't careful, then strength would react and cause hairline fractures in her hand again. Sure, Restore could fix her up. But she had been told by a doctor that breaking bones constantly would make them weaker. That's when she learned the quirk couldn't return the bones to their original strength. Saul told her that Selector had created the formula for Restore not long before his death, but never used it. It had been a difficult one for him to craft and required learning medical terminology while he hadn't been able to store it himself. The late hero had included it in the set of core quirks with the hope that his successor could use it. Upon hearing Saul's explanation, Verity reconfigured the quirk's formula to correct the issue and seemed to be successful. Of course, she wouldn't know until she broke another bone. However, she didn't want to push it, especially in the minutes before the practical exam began. Yet here she was, and painfully distracted too, all because of the stupid written exam. Truthfully, it wouldn't have been a problem if she hadn't overheard the other students talking about it. Apparently, their test had been the one she studied for. That test was harder than I thought it would be, a guy with a face full of exposed teeth said as he stretched his arms while his mouth made him look a little scary. Verity could tell that he was a nice person. The girl on his left, one with pretty dark hair, shot him an unamused look. You know the rules, we're not supposed to discuss the written test once we take it. Oh, lighten up Yaoyorozu, said the girl on his right before turning to the guy. Verity couldn't help but compare her hair to Lausiana's swamp water. The guy isn't wrong towards the end of it. The questions were starting to make my head spin. Her gaze met Verity's, who hadn't stopped staring at the girl's green hair. You must be insanely smart, Swamp Hair said to Verity. You finished several minutes before the rest of us. Verity wasn't sure, but she could have sworn she heard her mumble something like, and I thought Southern Americans were dumb, but it was probably that thing messing with her mind again. Oh, yeah, the guy chimed in. Your pencil was moving so fast that I thought it was gonna combust. Verity blew a puff of air at a stray curl that landed in front of her face before lightly smiling. Not really, she awkwardly chuckled. I guess I just wanted to finish before time was up. It was a big test after all. Yeah, it was one big test, just not the kind she had expected. You're too humble, Yaoyorozu said with a wave. If you hadn't done well, then you wouldn't be heading to the physical exam with us. A few candidates already dropped out. She's right, Swamp Hair said. Plus, your number was called first for this test. Rumor has it, the highest score for the written test is always the first to line up for the practical. That's preposterous, Yaoyorozu quipped. Past practical exams for recommended candidates put everyone in one arena, meaning they didn't have their number called. That's just a rumor some guy had spread around to make himself look good after being rejected by the school. Oh well, Swamp Hair said before lightly slapping Verity's shoulder. I bet you'll kill the practical too. Well, Verity said through her teeth, I guess we'll see. Great, just great. The last thing she needed was more unnecessary attention. A few minutes later, the toothy guy, whose name was Honuki, stood with her at the starting line of the obstacle course. 4 other candidates, whom Verity had given nicknames, stood there with them. 4 Arms, Zipper Mouth, Wind Dude, and Scarface. 4 Arms was busy stretching, while Zipper Mouth seemed to be waiting patiently. Meanwhile, Scarface stood between her and Wind Dude, with the latter trying to get the middleman's attention. She had found out about Wind Dude's quirk when he formed a little tornado in his hands to play with as they waited for their numbers to be called. With that guy and 4 Arms figured out, she needed to figure out the powers of the other 2 and fast. Scarface may have gotten his trademark from a fire quirk gone wrong, so that was her best guess. With him as for Zipper Mouth, she had no clue. All she could hope was that there wasn't anything sinister lurking behind her closed lips. As everyone prepared for the challenge ahead, Verity studied her opponents. If the course in front of her isn't an illusion, then 4 Arms will have an advantage in the jungle area. He would swing through the vines with ease. Wind Dude turned out to be a hyper one. Verity noted that she would need to be prepared to deflect any potential wind blasts since wind was a part of 12. She had learned how to maneuver well in windy spaces. However, a direct hit with a wind quirk could cause her to fall behind. But wind was probably the least of her concerns. Quickly, she glanced over to her left. Scarface was mumbling something to his loud neighbor, but she couldn't make anything out. But she knew his words weren't pleasant when she looked at Wind Dude, who she now knew as Urashi from his incessant yapping. His face had dropped, but it only lasted for a moment before he broke out into a smile. Poor guy, he wants Scarface's approval pretty badly. Huh, she thought. Scarface. Gee, she needed to find out his real name. Must be the real deal. Then why else would Wind Dude or Urashi get so excitable over another candidate? She'd thought that the recommendation exam was just full of a bunch of rich kids like Yaoyorozu, whose name she had instantly recognized. Her family had been mentioned in a few news articles she'd read on socials, so if that's not the case, then who the hell is this guy? Verity shook her head. She could figure that out later. Right now, she needed to come up with a plan, or at least come up with a few ideas of how to win this race with Saul's help. She had come up with a few ways to propel herself forward with more speed. Why not use her speed quirk? Because Verity decided on 12 as her known quirk while keeping the others a secret. Otherwise, she'd obliterate her opponents using her full power. Lost in thought, Verity's gaze wandered back to the arena before shifting towards Zipper Mouth, whose eyes met hers. The girl with short, silver hair turned away quickly. Ah, she's scoping everyone out like I am, Verity thought to herself. Smart girl. It's a shame that she won't be accepted as a student. The first alarm sounded, signaling that the race was about to begin. It had taken her a moment to decide what element she would use to help her win. But she finally decided on a combination of earth and wind. She would use earth to propel her forward and shield herself against Urashi's wind. Meanwhile, her own WN quirk could deflect any fire that Scarface might throw at her. It would be easier if she could use her shield quirk. But again, it had to be kept secret for now. Yes, earth and wind will work, she thought to herself. Technically, we aren't allowed to attack each other during the practical. But I've heard rumors of past candidates who went berserk to try and show off. Considering those rumored candidates weren't accepted, I doubt that anyone here would pull a stunt like that. However, we can use our quirks to slow each other down. I should be prepared for anything. Despite her nerves, Verity was confident that she could do well enough. Her plan was pretty foolproof, and she wouldn't waste time trying to delay anyone else. She'd focus all of her power on speed and get across the finish line first. Nothing could stop her. Well, nothing other than her ignorance, because her foolproof plan was foiled within the first minute. You see, Verity made one extremely stupid mistake. She'd forgotten about Toothy, or Honuki, who could turn earth into mush. She had only noticed it right as she went up and over the rock wall. Looking down, she watched as 4 arms became stuck in the dirt below. She winced as he struggled to free his ankles. That's when Scarface, who was riding a wave of ice, managed to use his ice to throw himself on the rock wall. His hands only gripped the holds for a second before creating another wave to send him over and past Verity. Ice. His freaking quirk is ice. She seethed as it dawned on her it was the complete opposite of the fire she'd been expecting. How could it have been wrong? On the other hand, Urashi created some kind of tornado to propel himself above the ground, allowing him to avoid getting caught too. Then, using wind, he lightly stepped on the holds before using a blast of wind to reach the next one. Since he'd been on Scarface's tail, he quickly made it over the wall, passing Verity with incredible speed. As the aftermath of his quirk died down, she looked back and found the mudslinger hot on her trail. Meanwhile, Zipper Mouth was nowhere to be seen. So, Honuki, unlike her, had chosen to use his quirk to add another obstacle to the field. For the most part, it had worked well in his favor. 2 of his opponents were left in the dust, and she had been distracted. On top of that, Earth would stop working in her favor pretty soon. It was the worst possible outcome for her as the path behind her began to ripple at best. Verity had 10 more seconds to use to Earth to push her forward. Unlike Urashi, her wind quirk wasn't strong enough to keep her off the ground the whole time. Hell no, she thought, trying not to panic. What do I do? Verity bit her lip. The 2 guys ahead of her were neck and neck now. While she was getting further and further behind, turning her head around, she saw the muck was now nearing her heels. Honuki's toothy smile was even wider now. The guy knew that he had her now. If she didn't figure out something soon, then the test would be over for her. Crap. Intuition was right, she mumbled to herself. I knew something was going to go wrong. It's been sending me signals for days now. Intuition was the second quirk she had chosen to add to her arsenal. Technically, it was the third since she had added language second. Only, she didn't count that quirk since she released it right after using it. Thinking it over first, Verity had ultimately chosen intuition as a way to honor Mimi. Plus, the old lady had made it sound useful, not to mention it was one Verity could simply copy. And after freaking out Saul with 12, she figured she would go easy on her by choosing this quirk. It really had been a good choice too. While it can only give her pieces of information, the quirk had prompted her to believe the practical would be some kind of race, and it was right actually. It had been accurate about everything other than Scarface's quirk. Then again, if she thought about it, the guy may have a dual quirk that allows him to use fire too. Intuition told her that thought was correct. Training and homeschooling were not the only challenges she had faced in the past year. Shortly after the new year began, Mimi passed away peacefully in her sleep. It had been an unexpected death, and it had hit her pretty hard. Verity had returned to Lausiana for the memorial and reading of the will with no other living relatives. Everything had been left to her, thankfully. Saul had been there with her to work through the legal proceedings as she grieved the loss of her last close relative at the funeral. Extended family members spoke with her and mourned with her. However, Leela was the only person who truly walked through that difficult time. Yeah, Leela was her only family now. While the past few months had been bittersweet, Verity was glad that she was able to spend last Christmas with Mimi, and Verity had celebrated the holiday in New York City as a reward for her hard work. The 3 of them had made wonderful memories together, ones that she would cherish forever. And there was something important that Mimi had shared with her during their last face-to-face conversation. I know I have intuition. The old lady's lips turned up as she cupped her granddaughter's face. But there's something I always listen to more, Mimi said, and pulled Verity into a hug, saying, my heart pulling back to look at Verity's face for one last time. She said, remember to listen to yours too, it won't lead you astray. Remembering those words, the girl swallowed. Verity needed to win this one for Mimi, but how? Her gaze studied the 2 teens ahead of her. Both were able to use their simple quirks to move ahead of her. Had she made a mistake? Should she have chosen fewer elements to take on her quirk? Had Saul been right about the elements being too weak? Verity shook her head no. Thinking like that isn't going to help me right now. 12 is strong. I need to calm down and use my head to think instead of freak out. Taking a deep breath, her gaze moved to the two teens ahead of her. To her shock, she noticed Scarface looking at her, and his eyes were as cold as his attitude. Frost covered his right arm, sending the tendrils of ice to his left side. The guy's mouth was in a tight line, and Verity stared back as a puff of cold air left his mouth before turning his focus back on the finish line. His gaze seemed to say, "I've got you beat, so give up." And it was that silent voice, though threatening and frigid, that gave her an idea. While ice wasn't her strongest element, and she couldn't make as much as that guy could, Verity could throw down just enough to slide her way through the rest of the obstacle course. It would help her stay far enough ahead to avoid Honuki's quirk too. The stilts of earth under her feet immediately died down, and she ran on foot for a second before shooting a path of ice in front of her without hesitation. She stepped up on the sheet and kept running. The initial change almost caused her to lose her footing, but she didn't stop. Frick, I thought I was wearing my cleats, she gasped. Saul had bought some for her. The hero had reminded her to wear them too, and of course, Verity completely forgot to wear them today. I should have known. Intuition was telling me I forgot something. Guess I wasn't paranoid after all, she grumbled. Thankfully, she had prepared for this scenario swiftly. She used metal to form some dull spikes at the bottom of her shoes while keeping her feet steady. The dullness of the spikes allowed her to slide on the thick ice. The makeshift cleats weren't the best, but they would work just fine. After she rebounded, Verity used one hand to continue forming a path in front of her, while using the other to push her forward. A moment later, she found herself going at a steady speed. It helped her to close half of the gap between her and the two boys in front of her, but it wasn't enough to catch up completely. It's not enough, she huffed, feeling the cold seep uncomfortably into her chest. I need to go faster. While her water quirk was powerful, she couldn't use it to propel herself quickly. Saul had tried working with her to use the quirk for speed, but it didn't work well unless Verity was in a body of water. She had been practicing her water blast, but they felt stalled. It had been an irritating problem for Verity, as she had particularly given that power a high percentage of output at first. She thought she needed to give it a higher percentage, but that backfired on her. Verity nearly drowned herself and quickly changed it back afterward. Water had been the one quirk she was most excited to use. However, she had a difficult time controlling it. She was beginning to find that ice was a little easier to use with hardly any practice, which only made her more frustrated. Keeping that in mind, she made a note to adjust those percentages later. In front of her, Scarface and Yurashi moved through the streets of the false city with ease. Intuition told her that the last area was the jungle, one that she had noticed before the test began. Ice had been able to get her ahead of him but not caught up to the other two. She needed another boost, one that would put her in first place. Honuki was far behind her now, but she wasn't going to use earth again on the off chance that it would fail her. What element should I use then? Wind? No, she thought as Yurashi's whirlwind hit her face. She was growing tired of that element drying her eyes out anyway. I need something with more firepower, but I can't use fire or it would melt the ice. Wait a second, she breathed before breaking out into a huge grin. That's it. Yeah, she couldn't use straight fire, or it would melt the ice too quickly. Still, there was one element, one she never used, that could do the trick. While it would generate some heat, it would produce blasts rather than a constant stream. Using bursts of energy should keep the ice at her feet stable while pushing her forward with great speed. The only tricky part would be using one hand to generate combustible energy, while the other hand to generate ice. She had never used two different elements like this before, so it was a risky move. However, intuition told her she would be fine. Probably. I'll be exhausted when I'm finished, but I can win this, Verity said confidently as she adjusted the ice output in her right hand. It needed to form faster than she was traveling, or she'd eat dirt. Like her last transition, Verity was a little shaky as the ice began to shoot out more forcibly. Frost began to cover her palms and fingers, chilling her to the bone. She tried wriggling her finger to dispel it, but the ice was stuck. She could melt it with fire, but that would be counterintuitive. Geez, how does that guy deal with this? This kind of sucks. Well, no turning back now, she said, moving her attention to her left hand. Verity took a deep breath, focusing on the switch between ice and energy. The change needed to be instant for her plan to succeed. Any hesitation or delay, and she would lose. Watching the two guys closing in on the finish line in front of her, she exhaled. And one more thing, Mimi said as the chauffeur opened the car door. A serious expression, one that she didn't wear often, crossed her face as she said, "Don't lose, ever." I didn't forget, Mimi, Verity said as a crackling noise began to sound off from her left hand. Netsu sipped on his cup of tea as he rewatched the monitor in his office. The recommendation candidates were incredible this year, so much so that he would have to make a special exception to the school rules this year because Class 1A, for the first time in UA history, would have 21 students instead of 20. He had been looking forward to watching Endeavor's kid, Shoto Todoroki, perform. The kid hadn't been a letdown either. Watching him ride the wave of ice was fascinating to think he could use fire too. Although he hadn't used it once since the practical began. While it was impressive, it was also a concern if Todoroki used fire. Then he would have won this race easily, unlike Verity, whose ice power looked comparably weak. His ice wouldn't melt quickly while using flames if the boy wanted to become a hero. Then he needed to fully embrace both sides of his quirk. Luckily for him, UA was the perfect place for a student like him to unlock his full potential. Yaoyorozu was another recommended student that he had enjoyed watching, a power to create almost anything at will. Incredible, she had found a way to create a cannon and a parachute, shooting herself over the rock wall and other areas before floating across the finish line. Meanwhile, Takage had used her quirk, Lizard Tail Split, to divide herself into smaller pieces and floated across the finish line shortly after Yaoyorozu. Honuki had been quite the surprise. He seemed to understand that first place wasn't possible with his quirk, so he found a way to become an obstacle to others to put himself ahead, although it's restricted to a certain radius. His softening quirk would certainly prove useful in battle. It had certainly thrown Verity for a loop. However, she had recovered splendidly. In fact, Nezu found her to be the most interesting candidate of all. Sure, he would have upheld Selector's favor regardless of her performance, but the girl didn't need his favor. She was quite capable of forging her own path. It will be well worth it, he said, taking another sip of tea, having her as a student. The principal smiled as he watched the future UA student's eyes glow in unnaturally vibrant blue. Mimi, Verity shouted furiously as the energy began bursting from her left hand. I won't lose. Despite the element being one that she unintentionally forgot about, it burst to life like a firecracker, giving her more power than she had thought possible. It was so powerful that her left hand was burning with raw power. And she was living for that sensation. It warmed her bones, making her feel unstoppable. More, she yelled wildly, embracing the high that energy brought her. Now she was only a few feet from closing the distance between her and the foreigner's. Verity would pass them in no time. Except, one of the spikes from her left shoe broke. As her foot went up in the air, so did the ice shooting from her right hand. Her back hit the ice, but she kept sliding along. Verity tried to sit up, but her hands kept slipping, sending her back down. No, no, no. It can't end this way. Metal shot out from her palms, producing the same dull spikes that were on her shoes. The ice screeched in response as she pushed herself up to a sitting position. Once she sat up, the view in front of her made her smile somehow. During her slip-up, she'd managed to produce an ice ramp that was pointed right at the finish line. Hell yeah, Verity shouted right as she was launched into the air. Flailing for a moment, she refocused energy into both of her palms. The blasts forced her through the air at a pace she believed could rival her speed quirk. The thrill and rush of it was incredible. As if it were all happening in slow motion. Scarface and Urashi turned their heads toward the source of the popping noise. Shock filled their faces as they watched Verity fly over them and past the finish line. Smug satisfaction filled her face as the ice guy's jaw tightened. Verity smirked at him, which only deepened his scowl. Someone needed to put you in your place, she thought after he treated Urashi like crap. The dude deserved to lose. Wowza. Number 55 soars into the wind. Present Mike shouted with wide eyes. Now if only her landing had been as graceful. Halting the blasts, she prepared for the rough landing. Her feet hit the ground first, but her velocity pushed her forward. Guess I'm eating dirt after all. At least it was after she won. Verity somersaulted a few times before slamming into a nearby rock. The sound of the impact was followed by a loud crunch noise that told her she had broken something, so it hadn't been a huge surprise when severe pain shot up her right leg. Groaning with pain, she was tempted to use Restore, but she couldn't. Verity had promised Saul that she wouldn't use Restore unless it was an absolute emergency. That's why, over the past 9 months, Saul had forced Verity to endure broken bones for an hour before using the quirk. Her mentor wanted her to be prepared for this. This way, Verity could keep Power Drive a secret. Back in September, Verity had broken a bone for the first time. She had fallen while climbing over the huge rocks along the seaside. Right as she was going to use Restore, Saul had stopped her. No, don't heal yourself, Saul blurted. Not yet. Anyway, she sat back down in her beach chair. You can use Restore after you wait an hour. An hour? My arm is broken, Verity shouted through sobs. It hurts. I understand, Saul said with a nod. However, you need to learn how to bear the pain at UA. Whenever you get hurt, you can't use Restore until you're alone with Recovery Girl. The hero had instructed. She's also aware of Selector's secret, so you can use the quirk and no one would think twice about your recovery. If that's the case, Verity asked through clenched teeth, then why are you making me wait so long? She spat. Because there might be a day when Recovery Girl isn't close by, she said grimly. You need to be prepared for that possibility. I know it sucks, but you can't reveal your powers to the world right now. It's too dangerous, and you don't have full control over them yet. Gritting her teeth, Verity pushed herself off the ground, hissing through the pain. It was nearly unbearable. But as she noticed Scarface's stare, Verity flashed a bright smile. The last thing she wanted to do was to appear weak in front of a callous guy like that. What she hadn't noticed, though, were the dropped jaws of the other candidates who had been waiting at the finish line. A familiar metallic taste coated her tongue, and a few students gasped, moving a hand to her head. She removed it only to find her fingers stained with BLD. Yaoyorozu looked horrified, but Swamp Hair seemed impressed. Whispers began circulating among the teens, and to Verity's chagrin, she realized she gathered more attention than she intended to. Saul had told her to keep a low profile, but Verity had done the exact opposite. "Yeah, I'm definitely getting a lecture tonight. Whoa, listener, are you okay?" Present Mike rushed up to her with wide eyes. That was an epic tumble. "Oh, Verity started and winced. "I'm all right, but I could use a trip to the nurse." "Sure thing," he said before rushing off. "Let me go and write you a note real quick." "Okay." She nodded as he took off, leaning against the rock she had crashed into. She sighed. Compared to the wounds she'd sustained while training with Saul, this was nothing. Watching Present Mike run off like that made her feel kind of coddled. This school better not make me soft. While waiting for Present Mike, she began thinking about her win, but her mind was mostly focused on energy. How was it so strong? In the last adjustment she made to 12, she had reset the element at 15%. From a logical standpoint, the output she had just demonstrated shouldn't have been possible. She wasn't sure how she managed to exert that much power through it, but she wasn't complaining. Maybe it was her indomitable human spirit. Who knows? As she waited, several candidates approached her to congratulate her and ask questions. Verity had to take a moment and explain the watered-down version of 12 that she and Saul had come up with. It was a carefully crafted story that went like this. From what everyone at UA would understand, Verity's quirk, 12, allowed her to control 12 elements of nature with a unique twist. Each element is assigned a certain percentage of power, and every 24 hours, she could adjust those percentages to focus on certain element. Really, it wasn't too far from the truth. Saul had wanted to leave out the percentage thing, but Verity explained it was necessary. Verity couldn't say that one power was strong one day but weak the next, including the ability to tweak the power output was necessary this way. No one would question the inconsistency of the quirk. It took a well-laid argument, but she finally managed to convince Saul that it was essential. Her gray eyes darted between the people that surrounded her until they landed on a mismatched set. Scarface was staring right back at her, and the scowl hadn't left his face. If anything, he looked more irritated than before, if that was even possible. Weird, she thought. I wonder why he looks so pressed. Once the questions died down, she excused herself to talk to him. Leaning up against a brick wall, he crossed his arms as she hobbled over to him. Her mind went back to the question she had before the race. Who was this kid? Intuition told her he had a dual quirk, which had to be a combination of fire and ice. Wait a second, fire and ice. With that thought, she staggered towards him with more gusto. "Hey you," Verity said, almost calling him Scarface, and she didn't need intuition to know just how much of a mistake that would have been. "You're Endeavor's kid, aren't you?" she asked, leaning against the wall for balance. A Todoroki. "Ha." Todoroki started. "What does that matter to you?" he asked coldly, running a hand through his red and white hair. "Are you trying to gloat?" "Cause I just came here to pass a stupid test. That's all. I don't care if I beat you or not, so give it a rest." Intuition sent alarm bells through Verity's body, sending chills down her spine. It was colder than the frost that had covered her hand earlier. This was sheer, unadulterated anger that coursed through this guy. Her gaze shifted to his scar before moving to the ground. Just what has Endeavor done to this kid? Taking a breath, she forced the thought away. Guys like him don't appreciate pity, and I don't know him or his situation well enough to offer any advice. Might as well just play it off. Moving her eyes back to his, she smirked. "Geez man," Verity said as she dusted off her gray sweatshirt, "you really that sore of a loser?" But instead of answering her question, the boy brushed past her with a glare, saying, "You're in my way." Verity hesitated a moment before pivoting around. "What a shame," she called out. "You have a cute face. Too bad you don't have the personality to match it." Todoroki didn't reply, but Verity could have sworn she heard him curse under his breath. "Maybe I'll have the pleasure of having a real fight with you soon," Verity thought with a smirk. "Todoroki, you could use a good butt kicking, and, from what intuition was telling her, a therapist too." An hour later, Verity was healed up and ready for her interview. Her outfit was standard business attire, a blue blouse and black pencil skirt, paired with a suit jacket and ballet flats. Her curly hair had been tamed into a stiff bun, which was causing her head to ache. She wore a little makeup too, which she rarely used since she began training with Saul. Not much sense in wearing something that will only sweat off. However, Verity was satisfied with the result of a makeover and smiled at herself in the mirror. As always, her gray eyes were bright and lively after a win. And this moment was no exception. Even without all of the quirks she was used to, Verity still placed first in the practical, beating the times of the other groups of students too. The teen was proud of herself, and she should be. The UA exams were no joke, and she had to be at her best if she wanted to make her acceptance look convincing. "I didn't lose today, Mimi," she whispered as she turned away from her reflection. "And I won't lose, ever." Shoto cursed under his breath as he walked away from the exam site. He'd been so close to winning the race. His feet had been inches away from the white line. Inches. Then that girl with a crappy earth quirk somehow surpassed him. At least, he thought Earth was her quirk. So, when she started throwing down ice and producing blasts of energy from her hands, he was completely caught off guard. Shoto had greatly misjudged her quirk and paid the price for it. However, while he was furious about losing, he was more curious about her powers. He knew how rare it was for a hero to have more than one elemental power tied to their quirk. Hell, his father had put much work into having a kid that could use fire and ice. Shoto couldn't name many heroes whose quirks were tied to several elements. One of them, the late American hero called Elementalist, had a quirk that allowed him to use the basic 4 elements, albeit not powerfully so. For a person to have a random mix of earth, ice, and energy elements was strange, not to mention they were strong elemental powers. Surely, there is more to this. As he leaned against the brick wall earlier, Shoto listened as she explained it despite being pretty banged up. The girl was animated as she answered everyone's questions. He noticed she didn't act frustrated or put off when someone asked a new question. Instead, she kept smiling as she answered in great detail, sometimes to the point of murmuring incoherently. I call it 12, she said while smiling at the mud guy, the one who had turned the earth into goo. Shoto had narrowly avoided the rippling mud at the beginning of the course. It was probably why the girl had switched to ice and energy. She would have been stuck if she'd kept using her earth power. 12, Mud Guy asked as he crossed his arms. The girl hummed. My quirk is a combination of 12 elemental powers. Shoto was trying to pay attention to her words, but instead, he found himself focused on her injuries. How this girl was smiling with a broken leg. He had no clue Shoto knew it was broken. He had heard the bone snap when she collided with the boulder. The crunching sound had made him wince, and he thought she might have died, but she didn't. The girl had persisted. She reminded him of a bug that refuses to die after being stepped on. Impressive, was what he thought as he'd watched her stand up after the crash. Shoto noted the smile that was plastered on her face. Had she been badly injured before? No normal person could endure pain so easily, and here she was now, minutes later, standing on one leg and chatting away like there was nothing wrong with her. Shoto knew he was scowling, but he was frustrated. Why was President Mike taking so long to write her an excuse? It pissed him off to watch her act so cheery when she needed help. He was tempted to find the teacher, until he heard something he couldn't ignore. 12 quirks, Mud Guy shouted, causing Shoto's gaze to snap towards the guy. You have 12 quirks? No, surely he misheard that, right? Yeah, he hadn't been listening to her. Shoto was too concerned with her injuries. But this 12 can't be right. It's not possible. There's no way. I mean, yeah, kind of, the girl responded, and her gaze moved to Shoto. He quickly looked away, acting oblivious as she said, although I'm not the only person whose quirk lets them use more than one element, so it's not that unusual. Shoto wanted to laugh at her words. Not unusual. Shoto himself had been bred to have a dual elemental quirk, and this girl was brushing off the fact that she could use 12 powers. Yeah, that isn't weird at all. Whoa, really? Yaoyorozu asked her with bright eyes. Can you tell us what they are? She trailed off sheepishly. Oh, right. I haven't told you my name, huh? The girl blushed, and Shoto leaned in a little as she said, It's Verity. Verity. Alice Ashford. Her gray eyes looked bright like silver as she said, but you can call me V. Verity. Isn't that another English word for truth? How ironic. Shoto ran a hand through his hair. The girl isn't being truthful right now. It's obvious that she's not okay. President Mike needs to get back here before she collapses. V. Takage said with a smile. I like it. Her body broke apart into several pieces, spinning around before piecing back together like a puzzle. He rolled his eyes. It was a dumb move for her to show off her quirk before her race. Shoto had crossed paths with Takage at some hero convention last year, where she had followed him around all day. That's how he knew what her quirk was, since she had different pieces of herself tailing him. Takage had creeped him out, which is another reason why he kept his distance from the group of teens. Of course, he wasn't too keen on getting close to V. Verity either. With a quirk like hers, he should keep his distance from her for now. Thanks, she said sweetly, with a slight tremble in her voice. As for the elements, they are water, fire, earth, wind, lighting, metal, lava, ice, shadow, light, plant manipulation, any energy, she said as she wobbled, almost falling to the ground. Whoa, Mud Guy said as Yaoyorozu rushed to steady her. Shouldn't you sit down, V? I'm okay, she shrugged. It's nothing I can't handle. I'm going to find another teacher, Takage said quickly before taking off. Great job, President Mike. Now girl really does look like she's about to collapse. Really, I'm okay, Verity chuckled, but she held on tightly to Yaoyorozu. I've been through worse. Worse? Some girl with a zipper mouth asked. Let's just say that my training back home in America was pretty intense, Verity said as Yaoyorozu helped her lean against the boulder. She pointed to herself saying, but I survived. America. Shoto knew she wasn't Japanese, but she spoke the language fluently, and he thought she might be European after all. Most of UA's foreign students are typically from European countries. The last time he had heard of UA having an American student was decades ago actually. The UA alumnus passed away sometime last year, but Shoto couldn't remember his name. At that point, he stopped listening to their conversation again as the other teens chatted. Shoto wondered what his father would think of his exam results. No doubt he would be disappointed with his son's loss. He'll be even angry when he finds out that he was defeated by some American girl, one with an elemental quirk similar to him. Maybe he should have gotten to know his competitors if he'd been more aware of their quirks. Then he might have had a greater advantage. Unlike Verity, he hadn't bothered to scope everyone out beforehand. Shoto had caught the girl staring at his scar, trying to determine what his quirk was, so seeing her puzzled over his ice when he had passed her in the race had been extremely satisfying. Her reaction gave him another reason not to use his left side. However, Shoto had thought it would be a waste of time to converse with his competitors. The majority of candidates present today didn't stand a chance at being accepted in UAS Hero course anyway. Why bother getting to know any of them? After all, the school only selected 4 students through recommendations each year. Not that Shoto had to worry. His father had already been working behind the scenes to ensure his son's enrollment. Endeavor his father was, if anything, persistent and obnoxious. Shoto might tell others that Endeavor is his father, but he doesn't truly see him as a father figure as far as he was concerned. Enji Todoroki was only a dictator and a sperm donor. And his mother, well, she wasn't much better. Then again, Shoto could never truly blame her for the incident that caused his scar. He hadn't seen the woman in years, but he still couldn't work through his feelings about her. Some days he missed her. On other days, he despised her almost as much as he despised his father. Growing up, his older siblings, Fayumi and Natsuo, weren't allowed to be near him. Endeavor thought they were distractions to his training, so he rarely spent time with them at home. He either trained or kept to himself. Fayumi would bring him dinner, but they didn't interact much aside from that. Endeavor was only ever around to train Shoto. He never cared about much else. The old man never asked what kind of food he liked or what his favorite hobbies were. Not that he had many hobbies. The point is, Endeavor's only concern was the Shoto become a greater hero than All Might, a goal that his father had never been able to reach. Thinking about his father's dumb wishes made him sigh. If Shoto was going to surpass All Might, then it is on his terms only, not Endeavor's. Shoto glanced at the watch on his wrist. Interviews would start in a few hours. He ought to leave and get ready after having dirt blown in his face by Yurashi. He was ready for a hot shower and clean clothes, but he wanted to make sure that girl was okay first. So, when his eyes moved back to Verity, Shoto was surprised to find her hobbling his way. Of course, his surprise was immediately replaced by frustration. Why and how this girl was able to hobble on a broken leg? Like, how stupid could she be? Recovery Girl is a hero with an incredible healing quirk, but she isn't an all-powerful miracle worker. Why not ask for crutches or a wheelchair? Wouldn't that make it easier for her? Hey you, Verity called out as she staggered towards him. You're Endeavor's kid, aren't you? She asked, leaning against the wall for balance. At Todoroki. Great, that's exactly what I wanted to avoid today. He clenched his fists anytime someone asked this question. It made him feel like trash. He hated being compared to. Endeavor hated being his kid. Shoto started, as a familiar, unbridled rage bubbled to the surface. What does that matter to you? He asked coldly, running a hand through his red and white hair. Are you trying to gloat? Foz, I just came here to pass a stupid test. That's all. I don't care if I beat you or not, so give it a rest. At his words, Verity's smile instantly dropped, and her gaze shifted to the ground. Crap, he thought while keeping a neutral face. I didn't mean to upset her. This was another reason why he didn't have friends. Shoto, well, he didn't know how to be someone's friend. Kids in his middle school class avoided him because of his scar. Additionally, his father forced him to prioritize training over going out, so anytime someone from his class tried to invite Shoto to hang out, he was never allowed to go. But he wasn't a complete idiot. Shoto knew he should say sorry. He wanted to ask her about her injuries. Maybe he could help her find Recovery Girl. Just as he was about to apologize, Shoto heard Verity take a deep breath before meeting his gaze. When she did, he paused, studying the look in them. Those silver-gray eyes were fierce and determined, yet there was softness, a kindness in them too. It made her look pretty, and in that instant, some part of him, locked away and forgotten, wanted to reach towards that part of her. He wanted to understand what it was like to live a life so vibrantly that he could smile through the most painful moments. As much as Shoto hated the mask Verity wore, he craved it too. He craved the kind of comfort, the hope that gave her the endurance to press through. But, in a split second, the lovely look was gone, replaced by one of mischief. Geez man, Verity said with a smirk, dusting off her gray sweatshirt. You really that sore of a loser? And just like that, Shoto's anger boiled up and over the surface once more. To hell with her. He thought talking with her is a waste of time after all. Too angry to answer her question, Shoto brushed past her, looking over his shoulder. He shot her a glare, saying, You're in my way. When he turned back around, his jaw clenched. He shouldn't let his rage take over like that. He should be more patient. It's not like she was trying to be vindictive. Maybe he should just. What a shame. He heard her call out behind him. You have a cute face. Too bad you don't have the personality to match it. She spat. And that's how Shoto found himself cursing under his breath. He didn't need someone to tell him how awful his personality was. It was a fact he knew too well. This girl was just an infuriating pest who thought she was better than him. Verity needs to be humbled. He thought as he got ready for his interview, I don't want her to be my classmate, but I hope I get the chance to fight her soon. Hello, Verity, Nezu said as she entered his office. Please have a seat and we'll begin. Sitting down, Verity took a deep breath through her nose and exhaled through her mouth. Her nerves were always the worst during the first 3 minutes of a test, however. She was shaking more than usual. Speaking to Nezu was exciting and terrifying, not to mention. She had many questions for her new principal. The first item on her agenda was to ask him about the written exam, although she was practically dying to ask him questions regarding her quirk creations. Thank you for having me, she said coolly, crossing her legs. Thank you for your interest in UA. He smiled at her before walking over to the window. After a moment, Nezu asked, I'm sure you have a few questions for me. Yes. Verity blinked. That's surprising considering his quirk. I shouldn't be shocked by how perceptive he is, but still. Oh my. She shifted in her seat. But shouldn't you be asking me questions first, sir? Nezu chuckled. I see you do have the Southern American charm I've seen in movies. It's quite endearing. He picked up a file off of his desk and opened it. This makes sense, considering you were born in Arkansas. Verity blinked again. Arkansas? Where did this question come from? She shook her head. He must be confused after all. It wasn't the first time someone had been wrong about her home state. No, sir, I was born in Texas. I've never been to Arkansas before. Nezu's smile dropped a little as he tilted his head. Verity, he asked as his smile returned, have you ever seen your birth certificate before? My birth certificate? No, she swallowed anxiously. My mother took care of those things before she passed away, and Mimi took over after. And I'm guessing Saul does it for you now? Yes, Ned asked, his eyes not leaving the manila folder. She does. Verity nodded and raised her brow. What does this have to do? Why? Sorry, he interrupted, abruptly closing the file. I was just curious about something. She thought curiously. I wonder if Saul made a mistake on some of the paperwork. Let's move on, he said, placing the folder gently on the desk. Go ahead and ask me a question. There's one that I know must be burning in the back of your mind. Actually, I have a question. Why was my written test different from the other candidates? She asked and started waving her hands. Not that I asked them about their tests. I just overheard a few candidates talking about it and my test wasn't the same. Oh, Verity, he said while taking a seat behind the large desk. But your test was the same as the others. It was. Of course, it was, he said cheerfully. You simply took your test earlier than everyone else. I did. Verity blurted out. How? How had she taken the test early? Wouldn't she remember something like that? She didn't have a short-term memory or anything, so how had she taken a test without, taking the test? Do you remember taking a practice test a few weeks ago? Nezu asked and folded his paws together, one that was on a computer. Her hand went to her chin. Yeah, I remember that Saul wouldn't let me have my phone, and the test required a passcode and, hey. The teen's head snapped up at the sudden realization. Are you saying that was the actual written test? She nearly shouted. Precisely. He grinned as he threw his paws up. Since your admittance was a favor, I wanted to give you an extra test, although I was very interested in your examination results that I couldn't wait. Saul told me how intelligent you are, which is why I asked her to help me administer the test remotely. An extra test? Do I have to take it now? Verity almost groaned. The last thing she wanted to do was take an extra test. You have already taken that one too. He chuckled. Let me be clear, Verity, you never needed Selector's favor to win you a spot at UA. You have passed each test with flying colors. Truthfully, the interview is just a formality to protect us, he said as his smile faltered more than once. Villains have disguised themselves as candidates to infiltrate our school. He opened a desk drawer, pulling out a small stack of papers. Anyway, your written score is one of the highest in UA history. You should be proud of your hard work. I passed. Verity grinned, and her gray eyes lit up at his words. She could care less about her rank, really. He nodded. You did rather well in the practical too, although I'm sure Saul will have some critiques about your performance. She winced, thinking about the cleats she had left at the penthouse. I'm sure she will. And while you did well, he said, the smile not leaving his face. I find myself confused, he said, picking the file back up. While you gave us the false explanation for your quirk, I know that it's based on the truth, correct? Yes, it is, Verity said with a sigh. The percentages of output and being able to tweak them is a part of how 12 functions. Yet, in the paperwork, Nezu said while opening the folder, you wrote that energy is the quirk with the weakest percentage of power output. Did you happen to change the percentage before the test? Verity moved her palms to face up, staring at them intensely. That was the question she'd been asking since the practical ended. How was energy so powerful at 15%? It didn't make any sense to her. What's more is how her body reacted to the quirk and how incredible it felt to wield that power. She closed her fists as she looked down on them. I didn't adjust the numbers before the test, really. She began and looked up at the principal. I don't know why energy was so powerful. Using that kind of power output at 15% should have been impossible, and yet it got me to first place. That much power at only 15%. His eyes were practically twinkling. Fascinating. To think that one minuscule fraction of your power can do such a thing. I can only imagine how much you will grow during your time here at UA. He coughed a moment before folding his paws back together. Although, there is one question that I must ask you before our time ends. Oh, what a short interview, Verity thought, feeling a tinge of disappointment at his words. If their time ended soon, she would have to ask him about power drive later. In the extra test, I asked you a question. Can you remind me what it was? He asked. Oh, so that was the extra test. Yes, you asked why I wanted to become a hero, she said, pushing down on the irritation that threatened to rise. Nezu plucked a paper out of the manila folder to stop any villain and save every innocent. He leaped out of his chair and made his way back to the window. I have your written answer. But could you remind me of what you wrote? Verity didn't see much of a point in it, but who was she to argue? Nezu probably went through a lot of trouble to secure a spot at UA. Considering Selector's favor, Verity couldn't believe that she had completely earned it. The least she could do is oblige this small request. She swallowed. There was only one problem in telling the story out loud, but she couldn't back down now. Nearly 2 years ago, she exhaled, my family was killed during the Great Throwdown in Dallas. Their only fault was stepping into the fight. They had been called upon by another hero to help, and my family chose to help so they could save those who couldn't save themselves in the battle. All of them died honorably. My parents passed while rescuing civilians from a sea-collapsing building, she said before taking another deep breath. Letting the air leave her chest, she thought, I can do this, just breathe, as Dr. Johnson said to. And meanwhile, my B-brother was working with other heroes when he was stabbed by a villain. Silverslick, her eyes began to burn as she remembered seeing Alton's body being taken away. Ellie, my little sister, she jumped and fro onto me. Tears began to fall down her face. So she smiled. Verity smiled because she had to. Heroes smiled, so she would too. Wiping her eyes, she forced herself to calm down. Ellie, she said and coughed. Ellie was the real genius in our family. Not me. She noticed Reckon was coming after me before I could process his betrayal. She had moved between us. The bullets that K killed Reckon, K killed her too. Verity closed her eyes, trying to focus. Surprisingly, she felt something soft take her hand before placing something in it. As she opened her eyes, Nezu was there with a sad smile on his face. Realizing he had given her a tissue, she pressed it to her eyes. Thank you, she said, before taking another deep breath. Anyway, no one in my family was a hero, but that day they were all true heroes that day. Once the part about her family was over, a switch flipped. Telling this part was easy because it was about her. If her paper had been solely about her family, then Verity wouldn't have finished writing it. Remembering my family and their sacrifice, I will become a hero that stops any villain. I will become a hero who can ensure the safety of every innocent civilian whenever I face a villain. I'll make sure that civilians don't feel the need to step into the fight. And Verity paused. This wasn't right. Her original answer wasn't bad, but it wasn't the right one, at least not for her. Nezu, now back at his desk, smiled at her. Have you come to realize something? She didn't answer him. Instead, she gripped the fabric of her skirt. Finding her right answer didn't mean Verity felt like sharing it. His head bobbed for a moment. Wanting to stop any villain and save every innocent is an excellent goal, but it's not your true reason for becoming a hero, is it? His paws clasped together. And while you could say power drive is your reason, that isn't the truth either. So, he said, leaning on his paws, tell me, Verity, why do you want to become a hero? Her body shook. It was a truth she didn't want to admit, one that made her feel like a traitor to her new quirk. But, no matter how awful, she had to come to terms with that truth. Her gray eyes moved to Nezu's beady ones. Mustering the courage, Verity said, I want to become a hero so that other families get to live the peaceful life that I should have lived. I'll work hard so they can. A lump formed in her throat. So they can take trips to the mall together. I'll subdue villains to make sure siblings can continue to play in the park with each other as a hero. I'll aim for the peace that will keep families alive and together. As the burden of that truth lifted from her shoulders, Verity beamed as she exclaimed, that's why I want to become a hero. A moment of silence passed between them, and the two stared at each other. Nezu's face, for the first time, remained neutral. His chin still rested on his paws, as if he were contemplating her answer. Was my answer wrong? She thought as he disappointed. The quiet was growing uncomfortably awkward. She was about to speak, but Nezu spoke up first. Are you certain this time? He asked gently. This is truly your reason to become a hero? Absolutely, Verity said without hesitation. It's written on my heart. I see, he said as his smile, albeit a sad one, reappeared on his face. Then you should know this. The path you've chosen won't be an easy one. When the day comes for you to make that pledge publicly, everyone will rely on you to fulfill that promise. Public opinion of heroes is a fragile thing that can bend and break at any moment. His smile brightened a bit as he continued, that's why I like how you mentioned that you will aim for peace. You see, All Might. I could never be a symbol like All Might, Verity interrupted with a wince. Sorry. No, Nezu waved his hand at her. Do go on. Okay. Verity nodded hesitantly. I can't be a symbol of peace like All Might, so instead, I'll support his ideals by doing my best as a hero realistically. I might fail at stopping every villain, she said with a grimace, but regardless, I will find a way to save every civilian as long as I'm around. I will stop senseless deaths. She bowed her head, whispering, I have to. Let me offer you some advice, Nezu said while putting the manila folder away. This world of heroes and villains isn't drawn in black and white, it screams with color. And there are plenty of gray areas. You will come across heroic villains and despicable heroes, good villains and bad heroes. This wasn't anything new to her. Reckon, she murmured. Nezu sighed at the name before continuing, as you should know, truth can be hidden in lies, and lies can be hidden in the truth. That's the reality that Reckon lived. He was a hero, but he was also a villain at some point. Reckon the hero stepped into a gray area, which led him into villainy. Nezu's face was serious as he said, Verity, in the future, your hero journey will force you into that gray area many times. Truthfully, it's not a good or bad place regardless. It will eventually push you into a specific direction. His beady eyes moved towards the window. You could be pushed to the left or right, or it could move you forward. Verity's nose scrunched up in confusion. What do you mean? He swiveled his chair around, facing away from her. In reality, one rarely chooses a side wholeheartedly, as you will soon learn. Hero society isn't a grand utopia, it's very flawed, which is why the rate of villainy has spiked over the years. There are heroes with dark sides, as well as government parties who commit atrocities for the sake of the peace that heroes have built. On the other hand, many villains are simply people who hate this flawed system. Of course, their methods of rebellion are inexcusable. However, not all of their ideas are evil. Like many people in the world, they want change, but instead pursue change vengefully. He paused for a moment to allow her to think on his words. To pursue change peacefully. She hadn't realized that villains actually fought for a legitimate cause. It made her mind drift back to the free felons in America. What had really driven them to desire the East Coast? She made a note to research it later. Verity, Nezu finally piped up, as you grow into a great hero, remember to approach the gray areas with caution. You won't be able to avoid them entirely, and they can consume you if you allow them to. If that happens, you may find yourself becoming an entirely different person in comparison to the hero you are striving to be. A different person, not hero. Hell, I won't be swayed that easily. Her resolve to be a great hero had been strong from the start. Still, Verity contemplated his words but wasn't worried. Thank you, I will keep that in mind, she answered. Of course. Nezu smiled and checked his watch. Unfortunately, it's time for the next candidate to be interviewed. Moving his paw down, he said, there are more things I need to discuss with you soon. Verity, on your first day of school, could you meet me here afterward? Of course, she nodded. I assume this is about power drive. Yes, he said, rubbing his paws together. Your quirk is very intriguing, and I have many questions about it. Funny, Verity said with a light chuckle. I have some questions for you involving quirk creation. Quirk creation, he exclaimed and checked his watch again. If only we had more time, but it can't be helped. Nezu grinned as Verity stood up from the chair. As she neared the door, Verity said, thank you, Principal Nezu. I look forward to learning at UA. Just remember, he said quietly, the results won't be announced for a few weeks, so please keep this information between you and Sol. A scandal at the beginning of the year wouldn't be pleasant for anyone. Yes, sir, she said, gripping the doorknob. For some reason, Verity felt uneasy as she walked the nearly empty UA halls. The weight of Nezu's words hung on her heart, pulling it into her stomach. In her mind, she had thought aiming for peace would be easier than becoming a symbol of peace. In her opinion, achieving total peace was impossible. That's why she would never stop aiming for it. Peace isn't some trophy that can be placed on a shelf forever. No, it's more like a cloud. Verity could reach for the clouds. She could touch them too, but she could never grab onto them. In her eyes, getting close to peace was good enough for her. As long as innocent lives could be kept safe and sound, that was all that mattered to her. Villains would always be around to wave away illusions of peace, which is why Verity would stop them at all costs. Nezu had only confirmed what she had already believed. The truth is that this hero society is an illusion of peace, but it doesn't make a difference to her. Verity had already sworn to protect that fragile peace. She would defend that falsehood for the sake of others. She had no problem supporting the utopia that heroes had created, so long as other families were able to live the life that had been painfully ripped away from her. A few months later, maybe I should light it on fire, Verity said, trying to fix her red tie for the 5th time. She wasn't sure how to loop it through correctly, and the silk had become wrinkled in different places. Why the hell is this so hard to tie? Today, her journey as a student at UA High will begin at last. The year of training and studying would finally pay off. With more training and studying, she had been picturing this moment since the day that Leela had tossed the schedule in her lap. Her acceptance video arrived in the mail about 2 weeks after the entrance exam, with Nezu congratulating her on a holographic screen. Overwhelmed and elated, Verity spent the past few weeks preparing every detail, down to the hero pins of her backpack. Her pristine uniform had been hanging on the back of her bedroom door. She'd been excited to wear it until she tried putting on her tie, which might be the most difficult villain she'd fought since arriving in Japan. And that's because she hasn't fought a single villain or criminal since living here. The country has strict hero laws, and Verity hoped it wouldn't soften her skills, but she had forgotten how ruthless her mentor could be. Leela was pushing her harder now than she did in the months before they left for Japan, donning her look as the hero. Leela sparred with Verity every Thursday, which made it the teen's favorite day to train. During their fights, she was allowed to fully unleash power drive. Leela allowed it so Verity wouldn't be out of practice with shield and speed in small doses. Strength and restore could be used under the radar if careful. Verity could also use fight style, a quirk allowing her to imitate any fighting style she watches. Unlike those three, she hadn't learned how to use shield and speed subtly. Shield radiates a noticeably bright blue light anytime she uses it, and speed it's hard for her to control already, so finding a way to slow it down was out of the question. Tweaking the quirks hadn't helped either. She was beginning to realize how lucky she was that 12 worked so well, especially after trying to adapt tons of failed quirk creation. Without Leela's knowledge, Verity had attempted to store 72 quirks that had either failed or needed major adjustments to function. If she didn't have restore, 32 of them would have killed her. She had 2 particularly close calls, nearly calling on Leela for help, except Verity didn't feel like facing death twice those days. Knowing the truth, the pro hero would have finished the job. Verity would prefer death by quirk failure over a laser to the stomach. On the other hand, she had successfully created and stored 21 quirks, 9 of which were reinvented quirks that Selector had formulated. All of them had been released after testing, but their formulations kept in a special notebook inside of her desk. Most of them were simple quirks, but they had the potential to be useful. Looking to 12's formulation for inspiration, Verity wondered why it worked while so many others failed. Maybe she had been more passionate about the quirk. Unlike the failed quirks, months of work had been put into 12. Taking the time to research and work through each detail took a lot of work, but taking shortcuts wasn't doing her any favors. The majority of these quirks were intricate. Paying attention to the finer details of the quirk is integral to its function, but knowing exactly how to craft those finer details is complicated. That's why she decided to put quirk creation on the back burner. Verity wouldn't stop formulating quirks, but refining and perfecting 12 is more important after all. It's the quirk she chose to display for everyone to see. She needed to master 12 before anyone else found out the truth about power drive. Otherwise, she wouldn't stand a chance against the villains that would come after her. That's why Leela had been pushing her so hard during training. The hero wanted Verity to be ready for any danger she might face in the future, and the villain in Second Sight's vision was the biggest threat. That's why Leela's gruesome training didn't faze her. Verity needed to give it her all to prepare for that daunting future. Plus, using 12 in mock fights and real ones thrilled her. Learning new ways to use the elements was fun too. Fighting with energy had been especially fun. Now set to 15% power output, energy had become her most powerful and well-controlled element. Through trial and error, Verity learned how to properly wield the element. Popping sensations can fill her palms at will, ready for her to strike targets or send her soaring through the air. The rush of adrenaline she feels when producing explosions is like nothing she's ever experienced before. Verity stared at her hands. It's easy to use while being extremely powerful, she thought while looping the red fabric. The problem is finding a way to boost energy without it wiping me out. Power drive gives each element a set amount of power through output percentages. However, Verity learned that most of the elements can be magnified in specific environments. For example, it's effortless to manipulate lightning on stormy days, which makes the element so powerful that blue electricity leisurely crackles along Verity's arms, which doesn't happen otherwise on dry, hot days. The flames of fire burn exceptionally hotter. Meanwhile, on sunny days, she can concentrate light into a formidable laser that rivals her mentor's beam in the right conditions. Each element of 12 can be exceptional, no matter their output. But energy is a little different. Unlike the other elements, energy can't be boosted through an ideal environment. It has to be stolen or redirected. By touching people, animals, or plants, Verity can steal vitality and direct it to energy. Discovering this had been rather unpleasant, as she had accidentally drained Leela during one of their sparring sessions. The moment the hero collapsed, Verity knew what she had done. Leela's face had turned a shade of gray that the teen never wanted to see again. Thinking about the incident gave her chills. Leela took a sip of her fruit pouch before saying, "If I could compare the feeling to something," she trailed off and took another long sip, "I'd say it was like being instantly paralyzed and nauseated all at once. Being in a controlled environment. I didn't attempt to keep fighting, but I'm not sure if I could. I barely made it to Emi's car." Ms. Joke was one of Leela's best friends from Ketsubutsu. Ironically, the pro hero became a teacher at their alma mater. Leela had instructed Verity to call the hero for help after the incident, who had rushed over quickly. She took them to the hospital and helped Verity feel at ease. Verity trailed off. The words she wanted to say felt stuck in her throat. She was supposed to help people with her quirk, not hurt them. Ms. Joke laid her hand on the girl's shoulder. "Don't be too hard on yourself, kid. It's not like you hurt her on purpose." She moved her hand and took a seat in the other chair, smiling softly at Verity. She said, "And Sol's fine, plus, you're still learning to use your quirk, right?" This joke was one of the few who knew about power drive. Leela trusted the hero and thought it would be good for a hero outside of the UA circle to be aware of the truth. If something bad happened to everyone in UA, then Verity would need another trustworthy ally. And Ms. Joke was perfect for that role. Leela had gone as far as making an emergency protocol folder for the hero, and Verity's intuition quirk was certain she'd thrown it away before leaving the hospital. Verity nodded as the hero sighed. Slumping in her chair, a chuckle escaped her lips. When my quirk first manifested, my brother was nearly committed to an asylum for laughing so much. It took us a while to realize what was happening, but everything worked out. My brother was fine, and my parents didn't blame me for the incident. It was just a part of learning, you know. Verity dropped the sloppy tie, letting it hang loosely around her neck. It might be a part of learning, but it was a hell of a lesson. And it was a lesson that kept going as she continued her attempts at boosting energy. Stealing energy from plants wasn't any better since it always killed them. The poor weeds she'd stolen from had turned tar black before disintegrating into ash. Seeing the plants die reminded Verity of her mother, who had revived wilted plants with her quirk. Controlling how much vitality she stole from things had proven difficult. Verity had spent weeks draining weeds to grasp that control, but stealing vitality was like drinking from a straw. The plant's life force absorbed into her quickly, so finding a way to slowly drain them seemed impossible. The process took a matter of seconds, and she would grimace each time the plant decayed. Taking a fraction of energy from the weeds without killing them was the goal, and she had failed miserably. That's why Verity decided to give up on bolstering energy if she couldn't boost it through moral methods. Then she'd simply focus on its innate power. She refused to hurt more people, plants, and animals. Okay, so technically, she hadn't tried siphoning from an animal, but she was certain it would work if she did. The real question was if an animal would die in the process, or have a reaction similar to Lilia's. Verity shivered at the thought. Taking the life force of living things, even from plants or animals, is evil unless the fate of the world rested on it. She would never drain the life from something ever again. I found a better way, she mumbled to herself as she began walking down the stairs. Funny enough, she had found her answer the day after giving up, and she found it doing the one thing she hated most: running. Running, the bane of her existence, has been the foundation of her training from the get-go. Nothing made her want to quit more than being forced to run along the sandy beaches of Maine for hours on end. Those first few weeks had been pure hell. She wasn't allowed to use speed during those runs either, but Verity, well, she learned how to cheat the system a little while running. Leela would carefully watch her from the cliffs every time her mentor turned away or took a phone call. The teen would enact speed for a split second since she couldn't control the quirk as it was active. Verity learned that this was the only way she could increase her speed subtly. It didn't last long, but it lessened the distance of her run enough to make it bearable. Leela never noticed either. And that's why Verity decided to try using explosions to increase her speed by creating smaller blasts. She could propel herself without Leela catching her. If Verity could catch a break from those blue eyes, the hero had her running along the beach at Tacoba Municipal Beach Park, which, to Verity's dismay, had no far-off cliffs to be observed from. Instead, Leela watched her from under the pier and rarely looked away. So, when Leela had to take a phone call, Verity took her chance. Mustering a few sparks in her hand, she began firing off ahead. At first, it seemed to work well. The small detonations pushed her further with ease. Leela's still on the phone. Verity panted with a grin. Maybe I can get away with it one more time. Except, as she focused on her palms, a surge of power filled her body. Unexpectedly, she felt like an egg in the microwave, like she'd explode any second. And that's exactly what happened. Her entire body seemed to light up as the explosion ignited. Verity's body had stalled as soon as it happened, causing her to fall face first into the shore. Blasts of sand scrapped her body as a huge crater formed in its wake. Once everything had settled, she passed out from exhaustion. She wasn't sure how much time had passed when she woke up, but it couldn't have been long. The sky still had streaks of orange in it from the rising sun opening her eyes. Verity groaned as she recalled what had happened. Lying in the middle of the crater, she groaned before wiping the sand off her face. A blush crept into her cheeks. How many people had seen her implode? What was the state of the beach? She was more embarrassed when Leela, dressed as Sol, stood over her with a smirk. I thought you learned your lesson after using speed that one time, she said with crossed arms. Cheaters never win. Looking around at the mess, Leela whistled. And now you have a mess to clean up. Won't the government take care of it? Verity asked, dusting the sand off her shorts. Studying the hole around her, she figured it must be about 20 feet wide. Was it necessary for her to fill it herself? From what I heard, this place was a dump before some kid cleaned it up a few months back. Her gaze moved across the length of the beach. Poor soul, she mumbled before flicking Verity's forehead. That's why you have to clean this mess. It's your fault anyway. Hey, the teen said, rubbing her head before getting to work. Having to clean up the beach after running sucked. This could be attributed to the fact that she was wiped out from the overexertion of power. Leela eventually caved, allowing Verity to finish the job after some rest. Despite her exhaustion, Verity was excited about her quirk's amplification. After some research, she had finally found her answer. Motion by moving around. Verity could build up the kinetic energy inside her and direct it into wide-ranged explosions. This type of explosion has two drawbacks. First, she can't create the explosion while in motion, yet the second is how much the move depletes her stamina. Verity had immediately fainted after trying it out the first time, which is why Leela suggested the team use it as an ultimate move. Now what should I call it? Verity mumbled to herself. Kinetic collision? Implode? Oh, maybe kinetic clash. That one sounds cool. Her excitement grew as she thought about announcing it to her classmates. Part of the hero course curriculum included creating their costume, coming up with a hero name, and creating an ultimate move. What would her classmates think of kinetic clash? What would All Might think? Verity had nearly lost her mind when she learned that All Might would be one of her teachers. He was Japan's #1 hero, and he had built quite a reputation for himself in America too. All Might had spent some time as an exchange student in California while capturing heroes with David Shield. Her family had a movie night watching the Might Shield documentary that had aired a few years back. Her feet felt light as she made her way towards the kitchen. Oh, Alton would have been so jealous. And Ellie too. She would have. Verity stopped in her tracks as her heart hit the floor. How could she think like this? If her family were alive, then she wouldn't be here right now. Her dad would be rushing off to work while her mom made breakfast. Alton and Ellie would be arguing over who got the last biscuit while she remediated. Guilt crept into her chest, making it difficult to breathe at her. But she wasn't surprised by the onslaught of feelings that hit her. She had expected to have some thoughts about her family on a day like this. In her eyes, it was fair to feel that shame. It was her penance for living so well. She deserved to carry the shame, to remember the real events that brought her here. Verity needed the memories to ground her, or she'd make the same mistakes again. Since she couldn't save them, she needed to focus on saving everyone else and their dreams. Verity bit her lip but didn't register the metallic twang that hit her tongue. Too many thoughts were filling her head. Her mom would never get to open a second storefront that she dreamed of. The promotion her father had worked so hard for was handed off to someone else. Alton never had the chance to make movies using his creations, and Ellie, sweet Ellie, would never get to ask Verity about her classes or if there was a baking course, because they are dead, and she's still breathing barely. She's living the dream, going to a prestigious hero school in Japan. Her parents and siblings were rotting underground while she lived in a penthouse. She was being mentored by pro heroes while theirs were being forgotten, given a quirk and a destiny. Verity was working towards a bright future they would never get to have. I don't deserve this, Verity thought to herself. I shouldn't be here. Sitting on the couch, Leela had been silently watching Verity. The girl had seemed happy mere seconds ago, only to look like a ghost now. The light that filled her eyes had been snuffed out by something, and Leela was sure it had something to do with Verity's family. Noticing the faraway look in her mentee's eyes, Leela drew a breath. Verity hadn't told her much about the interview with Netsu, but afterward, the hero had noticed something was off about the kid. Verity's expression then had been similar to the one she wore now, like she was reliving a nightmare. Mimi told us not to go through with therapy, but seeing her like this, Leela grimaced. Making decisions like these was the hardest part of being Verity's legal guardian, and she hated seeing the kid in this state. A year ago, she had fallen into her new guardianship role with ease. Luckily for her, the kid was kind of goody two-shoes. At least she was outside of her hero role. Verity tended to flip a switch when she went into hero mode. It was kind of scary how much she changed when fighting villains. Usually, Verity is a quiet bookworm. She holes away in her reading nook to research quirks and works on 12 among many other projects. But when Verity puts on that black cloak, she becomes an entirely different person. Well, if Leela could call her a person in that state, she's more like a silent menace. While Verity had only faced minor criminals, she was nothing short of a beast in the field. Her movements are cold and calculated, only failing her when she hesitates. The kid is also a quick thinker, and she could problem solve better than many heroes Leela knew. But that aura was enough to instill fear into the toughest heroes. Leela couldn't help but wonder why a racer would think of Verity. Typically, Aizawa isn't fazed by his students, and he's well known for expelling at least half of his class every year with the ability to erase quirks. He's not fazed by much and holds his own well for having a defensive power. The day Verity had adapted her first quirk, Strength, Leela had stiffened at the sight of the blue light that had wrapped around the teen. The glow swirled in her eyes too, which only made the teen more terrifying on more than one occasion. Leela had seen a captured villain's quiver before the young girl. One had pleaded for his life, leaving Verity with a perplexed look on her face. I hate seeing her like this. Leela took another sip of tea, mulling over what to do about the girl's catatonic state. If only she was aware of how powerful she truly is. Verity had proven to be the opposite of what Greg had prepared Leela for over and over again. He explained that training his successor would be a long and arduous process. Power Drive had taken him years to wield properly. Greg made sure that she knew it would be a tough road ahead for them. And yeah, maybe it would be tough, but not in the way he thought it would be. When Verity had created and adapted 12 after 2 months, Leela knew the kid was a true prodigy. Hell, she would have wondered what the girl would be like if she had been born with a quirk, if she'd been trained from a young age then. Leela mentally shook her head before glancing at Verity. No, I can't think like that. For Verity, controlling the many aspects of her quirk was the real problem. Even narrowing her focus to 12 divided her attention too much. Leela had tried explaining to Verity that she needed to work on honing one piece, or one element at a time. That's why she had pushed Verity to practice the 4 basic elements more than the others in 12. Because Verity needed to learn control. That's why Leela had been drilling Verity on water, earth, fire, and wind for weeks before the practical. So, the hero had face-palmed upon watching the footage of Verity's race. Being an assistant teacher, she had been approved to have access to most campus recordings. Netsu made sure that Leela could watch Verity's race right after Leela had signed her teaching contract. The lack of cleats. How many times had she reminded the girl to wear them? And using elements that she had never practiced with. How could she be so reckless? She ceased, watching the recap with Netsu. You call it reckless, but I believe she was incredibly resourceful. The principal chirped. I don't believe there are many people who would think to create their cleats. But she didn't have to do that. Leela groaned. She could have been more prepared. Verity knew what she would be facing today. Netsu folded his paws together with a smile. As heroes, we must be able to navigate to all kinds of situations and circumstances. We aren't able to pick and choose our obstacles. When it comes to fighting villains or rescuing civilians, preparation is great. But no hero can prepare for everything many times. We still must creatively gamble and adapt to win our battles. In this case, that's exactly what Verity did. She chose to take risks where it mattered and passed the test excellently. You should be proud of your trainee. Leela wished his words made her feel better, but they didn't, and she was as proud that Verity had found a way to win, although she did make the kid run like hell after. And that literally blew up in her face. Not that it was all bad. But Leela was still finding sand in the house weeks later. Working with Verity on her energy element had been a challenge, one that had managed to put the pro hero in the hospital. Seeing how much power the quirk had was astounding to Leela, considering that Verity had assigned it such a low position. It shouldn't have been possible for her to use it like that during the exam. A quirk inside of a quirk, inside of a quirk, for it to have enough power to propel her so fast. Leela adjusted the girl's training regimen immediately after her conversation with Netsu. Just because I won't let her demonstrate all of power drive doesn't mean I want her to look weak. Energy's power should give her somewhat of an edge now. Verity's use of fire and earth was decent. She could use wind pretty well too. What's strange is how uncooperative her water element is. Determined, Verity learned how to wield it well, but with a larger output percentage. The water element was still weaker because of her lack of control. That's why Leela had felt relieved when Verity had decided to switch its output with energy. It would give her the edge she needed as a UA student. Verity hadn't experimented much with the other elements of 12, but Leela hoped to explore them before the UA Sports Festival. While Verity can't stand out too much by winning, Leela wanted her to place in the top 10. Verity needed to demonstrate her power without drawing too much attention to herself. Speaking of attention, here, let me help with your tie, Leela said, setting down her cup of tea. The teen's arms dropped to her sides. Do I seriously have to wear this? Verity groaned. Can I at least lose the tie? Good, that snapped her out of it. Holding the red fabric in her hands, Leela chuckled. Trust me, Kid Ketsubusu's uniform was much worse. Your uniform is actually cute, and there. Her blue eyes brightened as she smiled at Verity. It's perfect. How did you do that so fast? Verity marveled. She rubbed the silk between her fingers. And I don't think it's ugly or anything. A melancholy expression filled her face as she said, but I already miss my comfy clothes. While Verity enjoyed dressing up now and then, she preferred to dress casually back home. She was used to throwing on jeans and a hoodie before heading to school. Wearing a skirt and stockings to school felt foreign to her, although Verity had to admit that she was impressed with the quality of the clothes. Oh, grow up, the hero said before flicking Verity's forehead. The teen yelped loudly, but Leela ignored her. It's only for a few years, and you will spend a lot of time in training clothes. What about my hero suit? Verity asked, rubbing her forehead. All in good time, the hero said, reminded of some changes she wanted to make to her own costume. You sent in your design requests, so it shouldn't be too long before you get the chance to wear it. Verity sat on a bar stool before picking up a fork that sat beside a plate of eggs and toast. Why couldn't I use the one I already have? Leela sighed. I know you want to keep wearing the suit Mimi made for you, but it's not durable. You've needed a new suit for a while now. Verity took a bite of eggs and swallowed, staring at her plate sadly. She replied, I just want to honor her, that's all. A smile crept along Leela's face as she leaned against the counter. And that's why I sent in a special request for your suit. Verity put her fork down. Special request. Leela hummed as she set a glass of grape juice in front of Verity. That's right. I sent a scrap of cloth from your old costume to be sewn into your new one. That way, your Mimi will be with you in every battle. The teen's eyes watered. Oh, Leela. She sniffed. Her face brightened as she grabbed the glass of juice, saying, thank you. The hero smiled before taking a sip of tea. Glad she liked that change. I just hope she likes the other adjustments I requested. Her gray eyes traveled the length of the door that could fit a whale through it. Verity hadn't known what to expect of UAS classrooms. Leela had offered to give her a tour of the campus, but she wanted to be surprised. Taking a deep breath, Verity opened the door. Aside from the height of the ceiling, nothing looked too out of the ordinary. The setup was different from the ones in America. A little stage was in front of the huge chalkboard. Resting in the middle of the platform was a podium, kind of like the one she'd seen in her Mimi's church. Well, it looks pretty normal, she mumbled before trying to find her seat. Number chairs look comfy too. 21 desks had somehow fit in the classroom. One row, the one furthest from the door, was one desk longer than the others. The accommodations had all been made just for her. Verity knew that if she weren't a UA student, then only 20 desks would be in the classroom. Gripping the strap of her backpack, she sucked in a breath. I can't waste this opportunity. They went through a lot of trouble to make room for me. I need to give it my all. For the first time in UAS history, 41 applicants were accepted into the hero course. The news was such a big deal that major television networks broadcasted about it for a few days. Leela had been worried about reporters seeking them out for information. Luckily, it was overshadowed by the news of All Might becoming a teacher at the school. Verity wasn't sure why Leela had been so concerned. Their penthouse was too secure for reporters to sneak inside. And it wasn't like anyone knew who she was anyway in the street. Reporters would most likely mistake them for tourists unless Leela donned her Saul costume, which was almost every time they went outside. Verity had been more concerned with UAS staff accepting an additional hero course student, but she soon found out that was a trivial matter too. Nedzu had made some kind of case for the exception, and none of the staff had objected to it. So, while Verity had earned her spot fair and square, the principal continued to give 4 other recommended candidates a place in the hero course. Class 1 took 3 of those students, while the other 2 were placed in Class 1B along with Verity. Todoroki and Yaoyorozu had been chosen and placed in Class 1A considering their quirks and familial ties. She wasn't surprised by the decision. The 2 lucky students who were placed in Class 1B were Mud Guy Honuki and Swamp Hair, whose name was, apparently, Takage. According to Yaoyorozu, the green-haired girl could split herself into a million floating pieces. To Verity, it was a strange quirk, but she could understand why the girl had been selected. Honuki had been a surprise. Verity had expected the whirlwind guy, what was his name again, to get a spot over him, but she couldn't deny that the Mud Guy's softening quirk would be useful in battle. Verity was psyched to have Yaoyorozu in her class. Her quirk creation was incredible. After Verity's practical, Yaoyorozu used her quirk to make crutches. She'd also walked with Verity to find Recovery Girl, being patient as she hobbled down the long halls. Verity had been worried that Yaoyorozu would miss her practical, but the creative girl had made it just fine. The 2 had talked over the phone later that night, with Yaoyorozu describing her experience in the practical. They had exchanged numbers while on their way to the nurse, which had elated her. Verity didn't have many friends in America, and the few she did have weren't, how could she put this, they weren't true friends. They were more of a ragtag bunch of quirkless students who stayed together due to social constructs. So, when Yaoyorozu asked for her contact information, Verity had to rein in her excitement. Making her way around the room, she noticed a few students were chatting with each other. Most likely, they had met during the general examinations. From what Verity heard, they got to fight robots, which pissed her off. Giant robots. What I would have given to pummel those instead of. Her thoughts stopped in their tracks when her eyes met mismatched ones. Todoroki's eyes were wide and his mouth parted open slightly as he stared up at her. His surprise was obvious, and Verity wondered why he was so shocked. Did he seriously not expect to see me here? Hands resting on her hips, Verity smirked at the aspiring hero. Well, what do you know? Looks like we're in the same class, Ice Guy. His lips twisted in a scowl, and his eyes chilled. It's Todoroki. My bad, she drawled, raising her hands with a smile. Todoroki, her eyes moved to the empty desk on her right. Pointing to it, she exclaimed, but look, we're desk neighbors. Verity sat down in the comfy chair. Now this was something she could get used to. No plastic or metal chairs. This was one of the small perks of attending a prestigious school. As she happily swiveled in her chair, Todoroki huffed, so, you're the special exception that UA made, huh? He turned to the front of the room. I should have known. Verity shrugged. Who knows which student was the exception? All I know is that Principal Nedzu said I earned my spot. She leaned over. So, tell me, did you earn yours? Of course, I did, Todoroki said blandly. At least, he felt that he'd earned it. His loss to Verity in the practical had been a fluke, and he knew that his performance was good enough to secure his spot. Endeavor might have pulled some strings, but Shoto had earned his spot too. Before Verity could respond, Yaoyorozu walked up to the desk in front of her. Hey, V. Yaoyorozu, hey, she said with a bright smile. Did you just get here? She didn't get here early. That's surprising, Verity thought as she tucked her backpack under her desk. Oh, no, I arrived about an hour ago, the dark-haired girl said sheepishly. First day jitters and all, you know. So, she pointed her thumb at the door. I decided to run some errands for a teacher and just finished up. Figures. Verity nodded in response. Errands on the first day. It wasn't anything major, I just carried some papers to another classroom is all, Yaoyorozu said as her eyes moved around to Todoroki. Oh, so, you were the other recommendation student who made it into our class. Standing up from her seat, she walked over and extended a hand to him. I'm Yaoyorozu. It's a pleasure to meet you, Todoroki, he said blandly before shaking her hand. In that moment, Verity was hit with an embarrassing revelation. Oh, I never introduced myself. My name is Verity, Todoroki replied, once again, blandly. You can call me V, she grumbled, crossing her arms. For the first time that day, Shoto's mouth tilted up. Fine then, V. Verity turned to Yaoyorozu to murmur a comment about the guy's dull personality. But raised voices from the front of the room caught their attention. Some blonde delinquent and a smartass with glasses were arguing with each other. What were they arguing about? Verity could care less, but something about the blonde guy bothered her. As they kept going at it, Verity heard Yaoyorozu mutter something about finding a teacher, but the two guys stopped as soon as some green-haired guy walked through the insanely tall doorway. It's him, the glasses guy said as he stood straight. Everyone's attention moved toward him, and gasps and whispers stirred around the room. Verity leaned towards Yaoyorozu. What's with that guy? She asked, watching him awkwardly converse with the glasses guy. From their talk, she learned that the green-haired kid's name was Midoriya, and the smart-ass, glasses guy was Ida. You haven't heard. That guy took out a robot with a single punch during his practical exam and saved. She looked around the room for a moment. Well, he saved one of our classmates, but she isn't here yet. Oh, wait. That's her. She pointed to the girl in the doorway. The short brunette was chatting away with the Midoriya, who had turned bright red. I ship it, Verity thought as she twirled a pencil between her fingers. Suddenly, a giant yellow bug walked up to the door. It took 8 seconds before you all shut up, he said while unzipping what was a yellow sleeping bag as it fell to the floor. Verity noticed the long scarf wrapped around his neck. That's not gonna work. Time is precious. Rational students would understand that. And rolling up to teach in class in a sleeping bag is rational? Verity studied the ragged-looking man. Leela told me that Aizawa is interesting, but I'll admit that this exceeded my expectation. Hello, I'm Shota Aizawa, your teacher, he said bluntly. Well, that was quite the introduction. Verity's confusion faded, however, when a familiar hero stepped up behind him. And I'm Liliana Garrison, better known as the American hero, Saul. Leela said cheerfully, I'm Mr. Aizawa's assistant teacher. It's nice to meet you all. The sunlight from the hall window illuminated through her hair, and some purple-haired kid seemed to drool at her radiance. Gross, better stay away from him. American, someone murmured before 20 sets of eyes landed on Verity at that moment. She wanted to sink into her chair. This was not the introduction she wanted at all. Aizawa sighed. Yes, as you might have guessed, your classmate, Verity, is closely associated with Saul, but I have been prompted to tell you that she was accepted into our school with the same merit as the rest of you were. Verity chuckled sheepishly as the eyes refused to leave her. Trust me, Saul would be more likely to make things more difficult for me, so don't expect me to get any special treatment. As their gazes fell back onto the illuminated hero, a menacing grin crept on her face. She's right, and Saul trailed off before holding up a pair of cleats. Verity coughed. Crap. Did she seriously forget them again? You, Saul said, pointing at her, can expect to have an extra hour added to your run this evening. Verity groaned while the rest of the class laughed. But it seemed to break the ice for her. A few of her classmates turned to whisper things like, that's harsh and you've got it rough to her. But they said it playfully, with a smile. It made her feel included. Right, let's get to it, Aizawa asserted, and the room quieted down. He proceeded to hold up a UA gym suit before saying, put these on and head outside. What the hell? Verity knew it wasn't a normal school, but what is going on? Quickly, she changed before heading outside.